The thermometer read 8 degrees when my father locked the door. I remember the click of that deadbolt like it was yesterday, the small final sound that told me I wasn't coming back inside. Christmas Eve and I was standing on the front porch in nothing but a thin sweater, watching my breath turn to ice crystals in the air. My crime, I asked my sister Charlotte to say please when she demanded I fetch her hot chocolate. Through the frost-covered window, I watched my family celebrate. My father laughed, raising his wine glass. My mother arranged cookies on a silver platter. Charlotte, the golden child, the princess who could do no wrong, lounged by the fireplace in her cashmere blanket, tearing through presents that cost more than my monthly rent. Not one of them looked toward the door. 47 minutes. That's how long I stood there feeling my fingers go numb watching my family through glass like I was already a ghost. I was 36 years old and my father was still punishing me for existing. Then headlights cut through the snow. A black sedan, expensive deliberate, pulled into the driveway and stopped directly in front of me. A tall man in a wool coat stepped out, looked at my blue lips and shaking hands, then glanced at the warm house behind me. "Lauren Margaret Kennedy," he said. "Your grandmother sent me, and everything your family told you about her about yourself was a lie." What happened next destroyed my family's secrets, exposed a murder they thought they'd gotten away with, and revealed an inheritance worth millions they'd been hiding from me my entire life. This is that story. My name is Lauren Kennedy, and I am 36 years old. I work as an administrative assistant at a small insurance company in town, the kind of job that pays just enough to cover rent on a modest apartment and leaves nothing for savings or dreams. I have spent my entire adult life trying to become invisible, which is ironic because invisibility is exactly what my family trained me to be from the moment I was born. The thermometer on the porch read 8 degrees Fahrenheit. I know, because I stared at it for a long time after my father slammed the door in my face, watching the little red line hover just above the mark that meant dangerous cold. The snow had been falling for hours, thick wet flakes that accumulated on my shoulders and caught in my hair, melting against my scalp and sending icy rivulets down the back of my neck. I wore a thin gray sweater that I had put on that morning, thinking it would be sufficient for an indoor Christmas Eve with family. I had not anticipated being thrown outside like a stray dog that had made the mistake of begging at the table. My crime, in case you are wondering, was asking my younger sister Charlotte to say please when she demanded I bring her a cup of hot chocolate. That was all. 2 syllables that most parents teach their children before kindergarten. But Charlotte had never been required to say please to anyone, least of all to me, and when I suggested she try basic courtesy, she ran to our father with tears streaming down her perfectly contoured cheeks. Within 30 seconds, I was being marched to the front door by a man whose face had turned the particular shade of purple that I had learned to fear since childhood. "You want to ruin Christmas with your attitude," he had snarled, his hand gripping my upper arm hard enough to leave bruises. "Then you can stand out there and think about what you did until you're ready to apologize." The door closed. The deadbolt clicked. And I was alone in the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you understand on a primal level that human beings were not designed to survive without shelter. I should tell you that this was not the first time. My body remembered the cold the way some bodies remember old injuries before a storm. When I was 7, I stood outside for an hour because I accidentally interrupted my father while he was watching football. When I was 12, I spent an entire November evening on the back porch because I received a B+ on a math test, while Charlotte received an A. When I was 16, I nearly developed frostbite on my toes after being locked out for having the audacity to ask if I could attend a school dance. Each time the lesson was the same: Lauren is wrong. Lauren is bad. Lauren deserves to suffer. The cold was simply the classroom where I learned my worthlessness over and over again until the lesson was written into my very cells. But I was 36 years old now, a grown woman with her own apartment, her own job, her own life such as it was. I had only come home for Christmas because my mother called with that particular tremor in her voice that suggested my absence would cause a scandal, and scandal was the one thing the Kennedy family could not tolerate. I came because some small, stupid part of me still hoped that this year might be different, that perhaps age had softened my father's cruelty or awakened my mother's conscience, or taught Charlotte that the world did not actually revolve around her designer handbags and Instagram followers. I was wrong. I was always wrong. Through the frost-covered window, I watched my family continue their celebration as if I had never existed at all. My father settled into his leather armchair with a glass of expensive red wine, the kind he only opened on special occasions. My mother bustled around the coffee table arranging Christmas cookies on a silver platter that had belonged to my grandmother, positioning each one with the careful attention she had never once directed at me. And Charlotte, my beautiful, beloved, perfect younger sister, lounged on the sofa closest to the fireplace, wrapped in a cream-colored cashmere blanket that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She was opening presents one after another, tearing through tissue paper and ribbon with the enthusiasm of a child and the entitlement of someone who had never been denied anything in her entire 32 years of life. The Christmas tree lights cast a warm, golden glow across the scene, making everything inside look like a greeting card, like a commercial for the kind of family happiness that I had only ever witnessed from the outside. They were so beautiful in there, so complete, so utterly content in their perfect little world where I did not exist. Not one of them glanced toward the window. Not one of them seemed to wonder where I had gone, or whether I was cold, or whether I might need something as simple as a coat. I had been erased from their evening as easily as wiping condensation from glass. The shivering started around minute 30. I tried to control it at first, clenching my muscles and hugging my arms around my body, but the cold was patient, and I was weak. By minute 40, my legs were shaking so violently that I had to lean against the porch railing to keep from falling. I knew the signs of hypothermia from a nursing assistant course I had taken years ago, back when I still believed I might have a future worth planning for. First comes the shivering, your body's desperate attempt to generate heat. Then comes the confusion, the strange foggy feeling that makes you forget why you were cold in the first place. And finally, if you are unlucky enough to reach the final stage, comes the warmth. The terrible, deceptive warmth that means your body has given up fighting and is preparing to die. I was somewhere between the first and second stages when the thought occurred to me, clear as a bell in the frozen silence, would they even check on me before morning? Would they notice if I stopped shivering, stopped standing, stopped breathing on their doorstep, and if they found me there tomorrow, stiff and blue and finally quiet, would they feel anything at all? Guilt, perhaps. Inconvenience, certainly. But grief. Actual grief for the daughter and sister they had just lost. I realized I did not know the answer. After 36 years as their family member, I could not say with confidence that my death would make them sad rather than simply embarrassed. That was when the headlights appeared. They cut through the snowstorm like a blade sharp and sudden, turning the swirling white flakes into a glittering curtain of light. A car was coming down our street, moving slowly, deliberately, as if the driver was looking for something specific. I watched it approach with the detached curiosity of someone who has already begun to feel disconnected from her own body. We rarely got visitors on this street, even in good weather. On Christmas Eve in a blizzard, a strange car was almost unthinkable. The sedan pulled into our driveway and stopped directly in front of the porch where I stood. It was black, sleek, expensive-looking, in a way that seemed completely out of place in our middle-class neighborhood. The engine idled quietly, and warm exhaust rose from the tailpipe like breath in the cold air. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, perhaps in his mid-60s, with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from some kind of dignified stone. He wore a black wool coat that probably cost more than my car, and leather gloves that he began removing one finger at a time as he walked toward me. His eyes found mine and held them with an expression I could not identify. Not pity exactly, though there was something soft in his gaze. Recognition, perhaps. As if he knew me, though I had never seen him before in my life. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at me for what felt like an eternity. Then he looked at the warm, bright window where my family continued their celebration, oblivious to the scene unfolding in their own driveway. When he turned back to me, something in his expression had hardened into anger, though I understood instinctively that the anger was not directed at me. "Lauren Margaret Kennedy," he said, and his voice was steady despite the wind and snow. "I have been looking for you for 2 years." Part 2. The Man in the Black Coat. I stared at the stranger standing at the bottom of my family's porch steps, snow accumulating on his silver hair and expensive coat, and I felt certain that hypothermia had finally progressed to the confusion stage. People did not simply appear out of blizzards on Christmas Eve speaking your full name like they had been searching for you across years and miles. People did not look at you with that particular combination of recognition and relief, as if finding you alive was the answer to a prayer they had been whispering for a very long time. This man, whoever he was, must be a hallucination conjured by a freezing brain desperate for rescue. But hallucinations do not remove their coats and wrap them around your shoulders. The wool was still warm from his body, heavy and soft against my frozen skin, and the sensation was so unexpected that I flinched backward as if he had struck me. He paused, his hand still holding the collar of the coat where he had draped it around me, and something in his expression shifted into a sadness so profound that I felt it in my chest. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I should have asked permission. You have had so little say over your own life that even kindness must feel like an intrusion." I did not know how to respond to that. No one had ever apologized for startling me with gentleness before. No one had ever considered that unexpected warmth might frighten someone who had learned to expect only cold. "Who are you?" My voice came out rough and strange, the words scraping past lips that had gone numb. "How do you know my name? My name is Theodore Hayes." He stepped back to give me space, though his eyes remained fixed on my face with that unsettling intensity. "I was your grandmother Margaret's personal driver and assistant for over 30 years. I was with her until the day she died, and I have been trying to find you ever since." "Grandmother." The word landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there heavy and complicated. Margaret Kennedy had died 2 years ago, and I had learned about it through a brief phone call from my mother, informing me that the funeral would be small and private family only, and that my presence was not required. I had not questioned this at the time. I had spent my whole life being told that my grandmother found me difficult, that she preferred Charlotte's sunny disposition to my quiet awkwardness, that I reminded her too much of someone she would rather forget. When she died, I grieved alone for a woman I had barely known, assuming that she had gone to her grave indifferent to my existence. But Theodore Hayes was looking at me like everything I believed about my grandmother was a lie. "I have been trying to reach you for 2 years, he continued, and now I could hear the anger beneath his measured tone, a fury held carefully in check. Every letter I sent was returned unopened. Every phone call was blocked before it could connect. When I came to your apartment, your landlord told me you had moved, but the forwarding address led to a vacant lot." His jaw tightened. "When I approached your father directly, he told me that you wanted nothing to do with your grandmother's memory, that you had asked the family to keep me away from you." "That is not true." The words came out before I could stop them sharp, with a desperation I had not expected to feel. "I never said that. I never asked them to keep anyone away." "I know." Theodore Hayes reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, moving slowly and deliberately, and withdrew something small and rectangular. A photograph, I realized, protected by a clear plastic sleeve. He handled it with the care of someone holding something infinitely precious. "I knew it was a lie the moment your father said it. Because Margaret told me exactly who you were, Lauren. She told me everything." He held out the photograph, and I took it with fingers that trembled from more than cold. The image showed a little girl, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, sitting on an older woman's lap. The child had dark hair pulled into uneven pigtails and a gap-toothed smile that radiated pure, uncomplicated joy. The woman holding her was clearly my grandmother, decades younger than I remembered her, from those few childhood visits, her face unlined and her silver-streaked hair swept back in an elegant twist. But it was her expression that made my breath catch in my throat. She was looking down at the child in her arms with a fierce, protective tenderness that I had never seen directed at me from anyone in my family. Her arms wrapped around the little girl as if she was shielding her from the entire world, and her eyes held a love so absolute and unconditional that it hurt to witness. I turned the photograph over with shaking hands. On the back in handwriting, I vaguely recognized as my grandmother's elegant script were 3 lines, "My Lauren, my heart, the one who understands." "I do not remember this," I whispered. "I do not remember her holding me like this." "You were very young when they started keeping you apart." Theodore Hayes's voice had gone soft, almost gentle. "Margaret fought to see you for years. She wrote letters, made phone calls, showed up unannounced at holidays and birthdays. Your father turned her away every time. He told her that you did not want to see her, that her visits upset you, that you had asked to be left alone." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "He played the same lie from both ends, Lauren. He told your grandmother you rejected her, and he told you that she rejected you. Neither of you ever knew the truth." The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I gripped the porch railing with one hand, the photograph with the other, trying to stay upright as everything I had believed about my family rearranged itself into a new and terrible pattern. All those years of being told I was unlovable. All those years of believing my own grandmother found me lacking. And somewhere across town, an old woman was being told the same lies about me dying alone, with the belief that her granddaughter wanted nothing to do with her. Theodore Hayes was watching me process this information, his blue eyes tracking across my face with that strange, searching quality I had noticed before. When I looked up at him, his expression shifted into something almost vulnerable. "You have her eyes," he said quietly. "Your grandmother's eyes. That same shade of blue that always made her look like she could see right through pretense to the truth underneath." He caught himself then, as if realizing he had said something too revealing, and cleared his throat. "She always said you were the only one in the family who inherited them. She said it was because you inherited more than just the color." There was weight behind his words, that I did not understand implications I could sense, but not yet grasp. This man had known my grandmother for 30 years. He spoke about her with a familiarity and affection that went beyond professional obligation. And he was looking at me now with an intensity that felt almost paternal, searching my features for something familiar, some echo of a woman we had both lost. I filed this away in my mind, another piece of a puzzle I was only beginning to realize existed. "Why are you here?" I asked. "Why tonight? After 2 years of trying to reach me, why did you suddenly appear on Christmas Eve in the middle of a blizzard?" Theodore Hayes glanced toward the house where my family continued their celebration, behind frost-covered windows, utterly oblivious to the scene unfolding in their own driveway. When he looked back at me, his expression had hardened into something cold and determined. "Because your grandmother left specific instructions," he said. "Instructions that were only to be activated under certain conditions. Tonight, those conditions were met." He reached into his pocket again and withdrew a small device that I recognized as a phone, though sleeker and more expensive than any I had ever owned. On the screen was a photograph that made my stomach drop, me standing on this very porch, hugging myself against the cold while my family celebrated inside. The image was time-stamped less than an hour ago. "Margaret installed security cameras on this property 3 years before she died," Theodore Hayes explained. "She wanted evidence, Lauren, evidence of how they treated you when they thought no one was watching. Tonight, that evidence triggered an alert to her attorney's office, and her attorney called me." He put the phone away. "Margaret always feared this would happen. She prepared for it. She prepared for everything." He walked to the passenger side of his sedan and opened the door, gesturing for me to get inside. Warm air spilled out into the frozen night, and I could see leather seats and soft lighting, a sanctuary waiting just steps away. "Tonight you are not safe here," he said. "Your grandmother's attorney is waiting at his home, and there are things you need to know before your family realizes what is about to change. Please, Lauren, let me take you somewhere warm. Let me tell you who your grandmother really was and what she left behind for you." I hesitated at the open door, my frozen brain struggling to process the enormity of what was happening. An hour ago, I had been wondering if my family would notice if I died on their doorstep. Now a stranger was offering me escape answers, the suggestion that someone had loved me after all. "How do I know I can trust you?" I asked the question, emerging from some survival instinct I had not known I possessed. Theodore Hayes smiled, then a sad and knowing expression that transformed his severe face into something almost kind. "You cannot know," he admitted. "Not yet. But I can tell you that your grandmother trusted me with her life for 30 years. And before she died, she trusted me with something even more precious." He paused, and his voice dropped lower. "She trusted me with you." I looked back at the house one final time. Through the window, I could see my father refilling his wine glass, my mother laughing at something Charlotte said, my sisters stretching luxuriously in front of the fire. They had not looked toward the door once in the hour I had been standing outside. They had not wondered even for a moment whether I was alive or dead. I turned away from that window and climbed into Theodore Hayes's car. As he closed the door behind me and walked around to the driver's side, I heard him add quietly, almost to himself, "Your grandmother did not die of old age, Lauren, and your family knows exactly what happened to her." The car's heater wrapped around me like an embrace I had not earned, and as Theodore Hayes guided the sedan through snow-covered streets, my mind began to drift backward through years I had spent trying to forget. The warmth was doing something strange to my defenses, melting walls I had built so carefully, and memories I had buried deep began to surface like bodies rising from thawed ground. I was always the one who was blamed. That was the first truth of my existence, the foundation upon which my entire childhood was constructed. When Charlotte broke my mother's antique vase at age 8, I was grounded for 2 weeks because I had failed to watch my sister properly. When Charlotte brought home a failing grade on her math test at 12, I was accused of being a bad influence, of somehow poisoning her study habits through my presence in the same house. Every scraped knee Charlotte suffered, every toy she broke, every disappointment that crossed the threshold of the Kennedy home somehow traced its origins back to me. I was the source of all problems, the explanation for every misfortune, the convenient receptacle for blame that no one else wanted to carry. My father had a phrase he used so often that it became the soundtrack of my childhood playing on repeat until I heard it in my dreams. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" He would say it when I brought home report cards with straight A's that somehow failed to impress him. He would say it when I sat quietly at dinner, trying not to attract attention. He would say it when I laughed too loudly or cried too easily, or simply existed in a way that reminded him I was there. Charlotte was the template, the ideal, the daughter he had wanted. I was the rough draft that should have been discarded. I learned very young that visibility was dangerous. When I spoke at the dinner table, sharing something that had happened at school or an idea that had occurred to me, my father would sigh heavily and announce that I was talking too much, monopolizing conversations that should include everyone. So I stopped speaking. But then I was accused of sulking, of passive-aggressively seeking attention through my silence, of ruining family meals with my moody presence. When I achieved something that should have made a parent proud, an award at school, a role in the class play, a teacher's compliment passed along at parent-teacher conferences, my parents would receive the news with a suspicious silence that made clear they did not believe I deserved it. Then my mother would mention something Charlotte had done, something better, something more impressive, something that put my small accomplishment in its proper, diminished perspective. I learned to make myself small. I ate less so that no one could accuse me of taking more than my share. I needed less so that no one could call me demanding or greedy. I took up less space, spoke in softer voices, faded into backgrounds and corners and shadows where perhaps I might be overlooked entirely. By the time I was a teenager, I had perfectioned the art of disappearing while remaining physically present. Sometimes, as a kind of bitter game, I would stand in the hallway of our home and count the minutes until someone acknowledged that I existed. The record was 4 hours. 4 hours of standing in plain sight while my family moved around me as if I was furniture, as if I was a ghost they had learned not to see. But one memory surfaced sharper than the others as we drove through the Christmas Eve snow. I was 10 years old, huddled in my bedroom after another round of my father's screaming. My face still wet with tears, I had learned to cry silently. My mother came in without knocking, which was unusual. She sat on the edge of my bed and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something soft and broken and almost desperate. Then she said words that changed everything, words I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times since. "I am going to take you away from here. Just the two of us. We will start over somewhere new." For 3 glorious days I believed her. I packed a secret bag under my bed with my favorite book, my stuffed rabbit, a photograph of myself that I thought I might want someday, as proof that I had once been a child. I imagined a life in a small apartment somewhere far away, just my mother and me, a life where I could laugh without being told I was too loud, and cry without being told I was too sensitive, and exist without being told I was too much. I fell asleep each night with hope burning in my chest like a small bright flame. On the 4th day, my mother acted as if the conversation had never happened. I waited for her to mention it again, to tell me when we were leaving to explain the plan. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. She never spoke of it again. And I never asked, because asking would have meant admitting that I had believed her, that I had let myself hope that I had been foolish enough to think someone might choose me. At 36 years old, sitting in a stranger's car on Christmas Eve, I still did not know why my mother made that promise, or why she broke it. The last time I saw my grandmother, I was 15. My father had driven me to her house for what he called an obligation visit, making clear through his tone that this was a burden he resented. While my parents and Charlotte made small talk in the living room, my grandmother pulled me into the kitchen. She took my face between her soft, wrinkled hands and looked at me with those blue eyes that Theodore Hayes said I had inherited. "They lie to you," she whispered, her voice urgent and low. "Everything they say about you is wrong. You are not the problem. You have never been the problem." Before I could ask what she meant, my father appeared in the doorway. My grandmother's expression closed like a door slamming shut. On the drive home, my father announced that his mother was getting senile, saying disturbing things, and that we would not be visiting again. We never did. Now, 2 decades later, something clicked into place that I had never thought to question. After that visit, my grandmother did not stop calling. The calls simply stopped coming through. The letters simply stopped arriving. All contact ended overnight, completely and absolutely, as if someone had severed a connection with surgical precision. What if my grandmother never stopped trying to reach me at all? Theodore Hayes pulled the sedan into a small parking lot in front of a modest brick building I did not recognize. The sign above the door read, "Ashford and Associates Attorneys at Law," in simple gold lettering, and a single light burned in an upstairs window, despite the late hour and the holiday. Snow continued to fall around us, muffling the world in white silence, and for a moment neither of us moved to leave the warmth of the car. Then Theodore reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew something that made my breath catch. It was a manila envelope larger than a standard letter, thick with whatever it contained. The envelope was sealed with dark red wax that bore the impression of 2 intertwined letters, M.K. Margaret Kennedy. My grandmother's initials pressed into wax like a signature from beyond the grave. Theodore's hands trembled slightly as he passed the envelope to me, and this small sign of emotion from such a composed man made my throat tighten. He had been steady throughout everything, calm and controlled even when describing years of blocked letters and rejected visits. But now, holding this envelope, something in his careful facade cracked just enough for me to see the grief beneath. "Margaret gave this to me 3 weeks before she died," he said, his voice rougher than before. "She made me swear not to open it myself, and only to deliver it when you were—" He paused, searching for the right words, and I watched him struggle with something he did not want to say. "When you were in danger from your own family." Those were her exact words. She knew Lauren. She knew what they would eventually do to you, and she spent her final weeks preparing for this moment. The envelope was heavier than I expected, weighted with more than just paper. I held it in my lap and stared at the wax seal, at my grandmother's initials, pressed into crimson, and I felt as though I was holding a piece of her soul. She had touched this envelope. She had sealed it with her own hands. She had thought of me in her final days, had worried about me, had made plans to protect me even after she was gone. The grandmother I had been told did not love me had spent her last weeks ensuring I would be safe. I broke the seal with shaking fingers, feeling the old wax crack and crumble. Inside, I found 3 items that would change the course of my life. The first was a letter handwritten on cream-colored stationery that smelled faintly of lavender. The handwriting was shaky, but determined the script of someone whose hands had grown unsteady, but whose mind remained sharp and focused. I recognized it from the photograph Theodore had shown me earlier, from the words written on the back, "My Lauren, my heart." This was my grandmother's hand, in her final weeks forming words she knew I might not read for years. The second item was a bank card platinum, and gleaming with my full name embossed on the front in raised letters, Lauren Margaret Kennedy. I had never seen this card before, never known it existed. Theodore explained quietly that it was connected to an account my grandmother had established in my name over a decade ago, an emergency fund that had been accumulating interest while I struggled to pay rent on my small apartment and wondered if I would ever escape the gravity of my family's contempt. The third item was a key, old brass heavy and ornate, with a number etched into its head, 2847. Theodore told me it opened a safety deposit box at First National Bank, a box that contained documents and evidence Margaret had spent years collecting. She knew this day would come, he said. She spent the last decade preparing for it. I turned my attention to the letter, unfolding the cream-colored pages with hands that would not stop trembling. The words blurred through tears I did not realize I was crying, and I had to blink several times before I could read what my grandmother had written. "My dearest Lauren," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my worst fears have been realized, and I am no longer there to protect you myself. I am sorry, my darling. I am sorry for so many things that I do not know where to begin." She wrote about regret, about the guilt that had haunted her for decades. She confessed to mistakes I had never imagined, mistakes that explained so much about my father and the cruelty he had inherited and amplified. "I was harsh with Richard in ways I did not understand were harmful," Margaret wrote. "I demanded perfection from him just as my own parents demanded it from me. I withheld affection as punishment when he failed to meet my standards. I taught him through my own example that love must be earned through performance and that failure deserved contempt rather than comfort. By the time I understood what I had done, by the time I recognized the damage I had caused, it was too late. Richard had already become a man incapable of giving unconditional love because he had never received it himself." The letter continued, explaining what I had never understood about my father's particular hatred for me. Margaret wrote that Richard targeted me specifically because I reminded him of her. I was stubborn, like she had been principled, like she had been unwilling to pretend that everything was fine when it clearly was not. Every time Richard looked at me, he saw his mother, the woman who had made him feel inadequate and unloved. And so he punished me for her sins, passing down the cruelty he had learned, but twisting it further, focusing it on the child who most resembled the source of his pain. But it was the final paragraph that made my blood run cold. "If you are reading this in the cold," my grandmother wrote, "it means what I feared most has come to pass. They have shown you who they truly are, and there is no more pretending, no more hoping that they might change. Theodore has instructions, and my attorney has documents that will protect you in ways I could not while I was alive. Trust no one in that family, my darling. Not your father, whose cruelty is deliberate and will never soften. Not your mother, whose silence is its own form of betrayal. Not even your sister, who has been shaped into a weapon against you without ever knowing what she was becoming." The letter ended with 3 words underlined twice in ink that had grown slightly smeared, as if my grandmother's hand had been shaking too badly to write clearly, "I'm sorry, Lauren." I folded the letter and held it against my chest, feeling the paper crinkle against Theodore's borrowed coat, feeling something inside me shift and rearrange itself into a new and terrible shape. My grandmother had loved me. She had worried about me. She had seen everything my family did to me and had tried in whatever way she could to prepare for the day when I would need to escape. Theodore opened his car door, letting in a gust of frozen air that cut through the warmth we had built. He looked at me with an expression that held both compassion and something harder, something that looked almost like anticipation. "There is more she wanted you to know, Lauren," he said quietly. "We should go inside to meet with her attorney, but before we do, you need to understand something." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that pressed down on my chest. "Your grandmother did not die from natural causes, and I have proof." The law office of William Ashford was warm and quiet, decorated with dark wood furniture and shelves lined with leather-bound legal volumes that looked like they had been there for decades. The attorney himself was a man in his 70s with kind eyes and a grave expression, and he greeted Theodore with the familiarity of an old ally before turning to me with a look of profound sympathy. But it was Theodore who took control of the room, spreading documents across the polished desk with the precision of someone who had been organizing this moment for 2 years. "I need you to understand what we are about to show you," Theodore said, his voice steady but tight with suppressed emotion. Margaret suspected what was happening to her in those final months, but she was already too confused to fight back effectively. She managed to get word to me, and I have spent every day since her death gathering evidence. This is not speculation, Lauren. This is proof. He laid out the first set of documents, toxicology reports on official laboratory letterhead pages of numbers and medical terminology that meant little to me, but clearly meant everything to the men in this room. Attorney Ashford explained that these reports had never been included in the official death certificate, had never been seen by anyone outside this office. They had been obtained through a doctor friend of Margaret's, an old colleague who had grown suspicious of her rapid decline and had ordered additional tests without the family's knowledge. "These reports show elevated levels of sedative medication in your grandmother's system during her final months," Theodore said, pointing to specific lines on the page, "far exceeding therapeutic doses. Levels that would cause confusion, memory loss, and inability to care for herself or make decisions." He looked up at me with eyes that burned with barely contained fury. "Your grandmother was sharp as a tack until 6 months before she died. She was reading legal documents, managing her investments, planning updates to her will. Then suddenly, seemingly overnight, she could not remember her own address. The family said it was dementia. It was not dementia." I stared at the numbers on the page, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My grandmother, the woman who had written that beautiful letter with such clarity and purpose, had been deliberately drugged into confusion. Someone had stolen her mind before they stole her life. Theodore spread out another set of documents, hospital admission records, pharmacy logs, phone records. A retired hospital administrator had provided him with these files. He explained someone who had known Margaret personally and had been troubled by the circumstances of her final hospitalization. The records told a damning story. Someone had contacted Margaret's pharmacy and her doctor multiple times in those last 6 months, requesting changes to her medication regimen, higher doses of sedatives, new prescriptions for medications known to cause confusion in elderly patients. Each request had been made by someone claiming to be a family member, someone with the authority to make medical decisions on Margaret's behalf. "When I traced these requests," Theodore said, "I found they came from 2 sources. The first was a man identifying himself as Margaret's son. The pharmacy staff described his voice as deep and authoritative." He paused. "Your father's voice is distinctive, Lauren. I have heard him speak. It matches the description exactly." My father had called pharmacies and doctors, had manipulated my grandmother's medications, had deliberately caused the confusion that left her unable to protect herself. I felt sick, physically sick, my stomach churning with horror and rage. "But there was a second caller," Theodore continued, and something in his tone made me look up sharply. "A younger woman who identified herself as a family caregiver. She made several of the most critical calls, the ones that increased the sedative doses to dangerous levels. The pharmacy had no reason to question her. Family members manage elderly relatives' care all the time." I asked the question that was already forming in my mind, though part of me did not want to hear the answer. Who was the younger woman? Theodore's expression grew complicated, a mixture of certainty and reluctance. "I have spent 2 years trying to confirm what I suspect. The pharmacy records show that many of these calls came from your family's home phone. The voice was described as young, confident female. He met my eyes. Your mother is 58 years old. Her voice has never been described as young, and I have never once heard her speak with confidence. The implication settled over me like a weight. The only young woman in that house, the only person with access to that phone who would have motivation to help my father, who had the confident voice of someone raised to believe she was always right, was Charlotte. But 2 years ago, when my grandmother's decline began, Charlotte had been only 18 years old, barely an adult, still practically a child. Why did no one investigate? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did no one question what was happening? Attorney Ashford answered, this time his tone heavy with professional frustration. When Margaret died, the attending physician ruled it natural causes consistent with age and declining health. Your father handled all the arrangements personally. He insisted on a quick cremation, claiming it was his mother's wish, and he actively discouraged any autopsy as disrespectful to her memory. Margaret never wanted cremation. Theodore interrupted, his voice sharp. She told me explicitly multiple times over the years that she wanted to be buried next to her husband. Your father knew this. Everyone who knew Margaret knew this. He pulled out more documents. In the months before Margaret's confusion began, she had scheduled meetings with Attorney Ashford to update her will. She had told me she wanted to make changes, significant changes that would ensure Lauren was protected. Those meetings never happened. By the time the scheduled dates arrived, Margaret could not remember why she had made the appointments. The pieces assembled themselves in my mind, like a puzzle revealing a picture I did not want to see. My father had known his mother was planning to change her will. He had known those changes would affect him negatively, and so he had acted manipulating her medications until she was too confused to follow through, then ensuring she died before she could recover. Theodore slid one final document across the desk, and my heart stopped. It was a photograph, grainy, but clear enough, printed from what appeared to be hospital security footage. The image showed a young woman walking down a hospital corridor, her face turned slightly away from the camera, but her profile unmistakable. Blonde hair, slim figure, expensive clothing even for a late-night hospital visit. She was approaching a door that I assumed led to a patient's room. This was taken 3 days before your grandmother died, Theodore said quietly. The timestamp reads 11:47 p.m. Visiting hours ended at 8. I stared at the photograph, at the familiar silhouette of my younger sister entering my grandmother's hospital room nearly 4 hours after visitors were supposed to leave. Charlotte had been there in the middle of the night, alone with a dying woman whose medications had been manipulated into dangerous territory. The question was no longer whether my family had killed my grandmother. The question was how deep the conspiracy went, and whether my little sister had been a willing participant or another victim shaped into a weapon she did not understand. It was nearly midnight when Theodore's sedan pulled back into my family's driveway. The snow had slowed to a gentle drift, and the house glowed with the remnants of celebration lights still burning in the living room windows where I had watched my family open presents while I froze on the porch. That felt like a lifetime ago now, though only a few hours had passed. I was not the same woman who had stood shivering in the cold, wondering if her family would care if she died. I was someone new, someone armed with truth, and the weight of my grandmother's letter in my coat pocket felt like armor. Theodore turned off the engine, but did not move to get out. "Are you certain you want to do this tonight?" he asked quietly. "We could wait until morning, give you time to process everything." I shook my head. They have had 2 years to believe they got away with it. They have had 36 years to make me believe I was worthless. I am not giving them another night. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, the same door that had been locked against me hours earlier. My hand closed around the doorknob, and I felt something unfamiliar stirring in my chest. I was still cold, still exhausted, still carrying wounds that had accumulated over 3.5 decades of being told I was not enough. But now, I also carried proof. I carried my grandmother's words, her love preserved in ink and paper, her warnings about the family I had always known was broken, but had never understood was actively malicious. I carried the beginning of truth. When I opened the door and stepped inside, I did not knock first. I did not call out to announce my presence. I did not apologize for interrupting whatever quiet moment they might be sharing. I walked into the living room where my family sat with their wine glasses and their satisfied expressions, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had the right to take up space. My father reacted first. He had been reclining in his leather armchair, a glass of whiskey balanced on the armrest, and at the sight of me, his face flushed with the familiar anger I had learned to fear since childhood. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, rising to his feet. "Do you have any idea what time it is? You disappear for hours without a word, and now you just walk in like you own the place." He expected me to apologize. I could see it in his posture, in the way he loomed over me, in the slight forward lean of his body that anticipated my shrinking backward. He had trained me for 36 years to respond to his anger with submission, to make myself small and sorry and desperate to regain his approval. He expected the same script we had followed 1,000 times before. Instead, I said nothing. I simply reached into my coat pocket, withdrew my grandmother's letter, and placed it on the coffee table between us. My mother picked it up with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting with growing horror. The color drained from her face as she read, and I watched her lips move silently over certain phrases, her expression crumbling with each line. My father snatched the letter from her before she could finish, his eyes darting across the pages, and I saw something I had never witnessed before in his face: fear. Real fear, the kind that comes when you realize your secrets are no longer safe. Charlotte, still wrapped in her cashmere blanket by the dying fire, rolled her eyes with theatrical exasperation. "Oh, great," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Lauren has found another way to make everything about herself. What is this, some kind of guilt trip from beyond the grave? You know, Grandma was basically senile at the end. She probably did not even know what she was writing." Then she added the words that stopped me cold. "Grandma never even liked you anyway. She told me herself that you reminded her of everything she regretted. She said looking at you was like looking at her own mistakes." I stared at my sister, seeing her clearly for the first time. Charlotte delivered this lie with such confidence, such absolute certainty, that I realized she truly believed it. She had been told this story so many times by a father she trusted completely that it had become her reality. In Charlotte's mind, she was not being cruel. She was simply stating facts that everyone in the family knew to be true. She had been raised on a carefully constructed fiction, fed lies about our grandmother, and about me since she was old enough to understand words. She had been shaped into a weapon against her own sister without ever realizing what she was becoming. Charlotte was not the villain she appeared to be. She was another victim, just one who had been given a different role to play. Before I could respond, the front door opened behind me. Theodore Hayes stepped into the house without knocking, without asking permission, without any of the deference that the Kennedy family expected from people they considered beneath them. He carried a leather briefcase that I now knew contained 2 years of investigation, 2 years of evidence, 2 years of preparing for this exact moment. My father's face went purple with outrage. "Who let you in?" he shouted, taking a step toward Theodore. "Who gave you permission to be here? This is my house and you are not welcome. Get out before I call the police." Theodore did not flinch. He met my father's eyes with an expression of barely contained contempt, 30 years of watching from the shadows finally given permission to speak. "This is not your house, Richard," he said, his voice steady as stone. "This house belongs to your mother's estate, which means it belongs to whoever she designated in her will, which your daughter is about to hear in full." My father lunged toward the briefcase, his hand outstretched to grab it to destroy whatever evidence Theodore might be carrying. But Theodore was faster. He held up a single document, a photograph that I recognized from the law office, and my father froze as if he had been turned to ice. "Sit down, Richard," Theodore said, his voice quiet, but carrying an authority that filled the room. "Unless you want your wife and daughters to learn what you did in September 2 years ago, the week your mother stopped being able to feed herself." My father stood frozen in the center of the living room, his hand still outstretched toward Theodore's briefcase, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. The document Theodore held seemed to have stolen all the bluster from him, leaving behind something I had never seen in my father before: vulnerability. He looked like a man who had just realized that the walls he had built around his secrets were not as solid as he believed. A knock at the front door shattered the tense silence. Theodore moved to answer it, and I watched my father's eyes follow him with the desperate calculation of a trapped animal looking for escape routes. When Theodore returned, he was accompanied by a distinguished man I recognized from the law office earlier that evening. William Ashford carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 45 years navigating the complexities of family fortunes and the people who fought over them. Attorney Ashford greeted Theodore with the warmth of an old ally, a slight nod that communicated years of shared purpose. He turned to me next, his expression softening into something like compassion. Then his gaze swept across the rest of my family, and I watched it harden into cool, professional assessment. He knew exactly who these people were. He knew exactly what they had done. "I apologize for the lateness of this visit," Ashford said, though his tone suggested he was not apologetic at all. But Margaret's instructions were specific. When Theodore confirmed that certain conditions had been met tonight, I was obligated to act immediately regardless of the hour or the holiday. He set his own briefcase on the coffee table and began removing documents with practiced efficiency. "I suggest everyone take a seat. This will take some time, and I suspect some of you will find it difficult to remain standing." My father finally found his voice. "This is absurd," he said, though the bluster rang hollow. "My mother died 2 years ago. If there was a will, I would have been informed. I am her only child. The estate passes to me automatically." Ashford's eyebrows rose with practiced skepticism that suggested he had heard this particular lie before. "You were informed, Mr. Kennedy, by certified letter, twice." He produced documents from his briefcase, official-looking papers with postal stamps and signatures. "You also received in-person notification from me 3 weeks after your mother's passing. I visited this very house and explained the existence and contents of Margaret's will in detail." He laid the certified mail receipts on the table, each one bearing my father's distinctive signature acknowledging delivery. "You signed for these, Mr. Kennedy. You cannot claim ignorance of their contents." Ashford's voice carried the weight of someone who had built an entire career on attention to detail. "You chose not to inform your daughters about the will's existence. That was your decision, but it was not your right to make on their behalf." My mother had gone very still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on some middle distance, as if she could escape this room through sheer force of will. Charlotte looked confused for the first time all evening, her usual confidence shaken by developments she clearly had not anticipated. She had expected this night to follow the familiar script: Lauren gets punished. Lauren apologizes, the family returns to normal. She had not prepared for anything like this. "Let us proceed," Ashford said, unfolding a formal document covered in dense legal text. "Margaret Elizabeth Kennedy, being of sound mind and clear intention, executed this will and trust document 10 years ago. I have served as the executor of her estate since that time, and I am now fulfilling my legal obligation to read its contents to the designated beneficiaries." The room fell completely silent as Ashford began to read. What followed would have seemed impossible to me just hours earlier, a fantasy from a life I was never meant to live. My grandmother had left 78% of her total estate to me. To Lauren Margaret Kennedy, the granddaughter she had been told did not want to see her the granddaughter she had fought to reach for years. The inheritance included this house, the house where I had been abused and punished and made to feel worthless for my entire childhood. It included a portfolio of investment properties I had never known existed. It included shares in 3 businesses Margaret had founded or invested in over her long career. And it included a trust fund that had been accumulating interest for over 2 decades, a fund established in my name when I was still a child. I had been told my whole life that my grandmother was comfortable but not wealthy, that she lived modestly because she valued simplicity over extravagance. Another lie. Another manipulation designed to keep me ignorant of what I might be owed. The remaining 22% was divided among other beneficiaries. Charlotte would receive a modest sum enough to establish herself, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle she had grown accustomed to. My father received nothing explicitly and deliberately. The will stated that Richard Kennedy had been provided for during Margaret's lifetime and required no further consideration from her estate. But it was my mother's bequest that caught my attention and held it. Helen Kennedy was to receive $50,000 with a notation that made my blood run cold. This represents the amount I provided Helen in 1998, plus appropriate interest. I trust she remembers the purpose for which it was given and the promise that was broken. I watched my mother's face go white as chalk. She began to stammer something, words that might have been explanations or excuses, but my father silenced her with a sharp look that carried unmistakable warning. She closed her mouth and stared at her hands, and I filed the detail away in my mind for later examination. 1998. I would have been 10 years old. The same year my mother had sat on the edge of my bed and promised to take me away from this place. The same year she had given me 3 days of hope before pretending the conversation had never happened. What had my grandmother given my mother money for, and what promise had been broken? Attorney Ashford set aside the main will and produced a second envelope from his briefcase. This one was smaller, sealed with the same wax bearing my grandmother's initials, marked with words that made my heart stutter, for Lauren only to be opened under conditions of familial cruelty. He looked at me with an expression of deep compassion. "Your grandmother anticipated tonight, Miss Kennedy. She prepared a separate document that no one else has ever seen to be opened only if certain conditions were met." He held the envelope out toward me. "Theodore confirmed those conditions earlier this evening. The choice is yours now. Shall I read it here, or would you prefer privacy?" I looked at the sealed envelope in Attorney Ashford's hands at my grandmother's initials, pressed into dark red wax, and I made my decision without hesitation. "Read it here," I said. "Read it aloud. I want them to hear every word." My father started to protest, but Theodore silenced him with a single sharp look. Ashford broke the seal carefully, almost reverently, and unfolded the pages within. When he began to read, his measured professional voice could not disguise the emotional weight of my grandmother's words. "My dearest Lauren," the letter began, and I felt tears prick at my eyes, despite my determination to remain composed. "If you are hearing this, then the worst has happened, and I am no longer there to hold your hand through it. I want you to know that I chose you as my heir, not because you are perfect, not because you achieved more than your sister, not because you performed better on some invisible scorecard your father keeps in his cruel heart. I chose you because you possess something this family has lost, something I fear we lost generations ago, a heart that feels the pain of others, a conscience that will not be silenced, no matter how many times it is punished, a strength that bends under pressure, but refuses to break." I watched my family as these words filled the room. My father's face had gone rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. My mother wept silently into her hands, though whether from guilt or self-pity, I could no longer tell. Charlotte sat frozen, her cashmere blanket clutched around her shoulders, like armor against truths she was only beginning to comprehend. Ashford continued reading. "Your father sees these qualities as weaknesses. He has spent your entire life trying to crush them out of you, to remake you in his own image, to transform you into someone as cold and calculating as himself. He failed Lauren. You are still standing, you are still feeling, you are still fighting. And now, my darling, you will have the resources to build a life completely free from their cruelty." The words hung in the air like a benediction, like a blessing I had waited 36 years to receive. My grandmother had seen me. She had understood me. She had loved me for the very qualities my family had tried to destroy. But one question still burned in my mind, and I could not let it wait any longer. "Stop," I said, and Ashford paused mid-sentence. I turned to face my mother, who was still crying into her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that might have moved me once. "What money in 1998? What promise did you break?" The room went very still. My mother's sobs grew louder, more desperate, but I no longer trusted her tears. I had seen them deployed too many times throughout my childhood, always as shields against accountability, always as tools to redirect attention from her failures to her suffering. She was not crying because she felt guilty. She was crying because she had been caught. Theodore stepped forward, and I saw my mother flinch visibly at his approach. He held a document that looked like a bank statement, old and yellowed, but preserved with careful attention. In 1998, Theodore said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, Margaret became so concerned about Lauren's treatment that she approached Helen privately. She offered $100,000, enough to establish a new life somewhere far from Richard's influence. The money was meant to help Helen leave her husband and take Lauren somewhere safe, somewhere she could grow up without constant abuse and criticism. He paused, letting this information settle over us all. My mother's sobbing had grown quieter, more controlled, as if she knew what was coming next. Helen agreed to the arrangement, Theodore continued. She took the money, all of it. Another pause, heavier than the last. She never left. She never took Lauren anywhere. Bank records show that the money was used to pay off debts Richard had accumulated through poor investments and to fund Charlotte's enrollment in an expensive private school the following year. I stared at my mother, feeling something fundamental crack and crumble inside my chest. The last small hope I had carried without knowing it, the hope that my mother was simply weak rather than actively complicit, died in that moment like a candle flame pinched between cruel fingers. I wanted to leave. My mother choked out words, tumbling over each other in desperate explanation. I truly intended to follow through. I had plans. I had packed bags hidden in the closet, but Richard found the money. He found out what I was planning and he threatened me. She looked up, her face blotched and swollen mascara running in dark tracks down her cheeks. He said if I tried to leave, he would tell everyone I was mentally unstable. He said he would take Charlotte away from me and I would never see her again. He said no court would give custody to a woman who had stolen money from her mother-in-law. I was trapped. I listened to this explanation and felt nothing but cold clarity. Yes, my mother may have been threatened. Yes, my father was capable of exactly the kind of manipulation she described. But she had still made a choice. She had chosen to keep Charlotte and sacrifice me. She had taken my grandmother's money under false pretenses and used it to benefit the very people who were destroying me. And for 26 years, she could have confessed. She could have apologized. She could have tried to make it right in any small way. Instead, she chose silence. She watched me suffer and said nothing. Charlotte had been watching this revelation unfold with an expression I had never seen on her face before. The contempt and superiority were gone, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion, almost like doubt. But Dad said grandmother wanted me to have the best education because I was special, Charlotte whispered almost to herself. He said she specifically requested that money go toward my school. That is why I went to private school, because grandmother believed in me. She looked at our parents with new eyes, and I could see the first cracks forming in the foundation of everything she had been taught to believe. If they had lied about the money, if they had lied about grandmother's feelings toward me, what else had they lied about? I noticed something else in that moment, something I had never thought to question before. Charlotte's eyes were green, the same shade as our mother's. Our father's eyes were brown. But my eyes were blue, the distinctive pale blue that Theodore had said I inherited from grandmother, the same shade of blue that Theodore himself possessed. Before I could pursue this thought, Attorney Ashford cleared his throat to reclaim the room's attention. "There is one more provision we must discuss tonight," he said, his voice carrying a new weight of significance. Margaret included a conditional clause in her will, one she hoped would never need to be activated. She called it the cruelty clause. He looked directly at my father, and something in his expression suggested grim satisfaction. "I am afraid, Mr. Kennedy, that the events of this evening have triggered its activation." Attorney Ashford withdrew another document from his briefcase, this one bound in a blue legal cover that suggested particular importance. He held it with the careful reverence of someone who had helped craft something unusual, something that existed at the very edge of what a state law could accomplish. "The cruelty clause." He began, his voice taking on the measured precision of a man explaining complex machinery, is a conditional provision Margaret insisted we include in her will. I will admit that when she first proposed it, I had reservations about its enforceability. But Margaret was nothing if not thorough, and we spent considerable time ensuring the language would hold up under legal scrutiny. He paused to let the room settle into reluctant attention. My father had stopped his blustering, perhaps sensing that interrupting now would only make things worse. My mother's tears had subsided into quiet sniffling. Charlotte remained unnaturally still, her eyes fixed on the document in Ashford's hands. The clause states that if Lauren can demonstrate she has been subjected to cruelty, abuse, or deliberate harm by any family member after the date of the will's execution, she has the legal authority to revoke or reduce that family member's inheritance. Ashford looked directly at me as he continued. Your grandmother defined cruelty broadly and deliberately. Physical harm, of course, but also emotional abuse, financial exploitation, deliberate isolation, or any action that a reasonable person would consider designed to cause suffering. He set the document on the table, where everyone could see the dense paragraphs of legal text, the signatures and notarizations that made it binding. Margaret understood that a will alone could not protect you. Money can be contested. Documents can be challenged in court for years. But she wanted to create consequences, real and immediate consequences, for anyone who continued to hurt you after she was gone. She wanted your family to know that their treatment of you would have a price. My father finally found his voice, though it emerged weaker than his usual bluster. This is ridiculous. You cannot enforce something like this. It is subjective. Who decides what constitutes cruelty? Lauren could claim anything and take everything. That, Theodore said, stepping forward with his laptop, is why Margaret asked me to install security cameras on this property 3 years ago. He opened the laptop and turned the screen to face the room. The image that appeared made my stomach clench, even though I had lived through it only hours earlier. There I was, captured in the greenish tint of night vision footage, standing on the front porch in my thin gray sweater. The timestamp in the corner read, "Today's date, Christmas Eve," with the time clicking forward minute by minute. Theodore pressed play, and my family watched in silence as the scene unfolded. My father's face appeared in the frame purple with anger, his hand on my arm as he marched me toward the door. The audio was muffled but audible, his voice telling me to stand outside and think about what I had done. The door closing, the deadbolt clicking into place. Then the camera angle shifted to show the window, and through it, the living room where my family had continued their celebration. The footage showed my father returning to his chair and picking up his wine glass. My mother arranging cookies on her silver platter. Charlotte unwrapping presents by the fire, laughing at something on her phone. And outside, visible in the corner of the frame, a figure standing alone in the snow, hugging herself against the cold. 47 minutes of footage. 47 minutes of me shivering on the porch while my family celebrated Christmas, as if I did not exist. The temperature reading from a weather overlay showed 8 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind chill made it feel even colder. "This is illegal surveillance," my father shouted, lurching to his feet. "You had no right to install cameras on my property. I will sue every single person in this room. I will have you arrested for invasion of privacy." "This is not your property," Ashford replied calmly. "This house belonged to Margaret Kennedy until her death, and now it belongs to her estate. She had every right to install security measures on property she owned, and the footage was captured from outside the home in areas where there is no reasonable expectation of privacy under the law." My mother had dissolved into fresh tears. "I did not know how cold it was," she insisted, her voice high and desperate. "I thought Richard would let her back in after just a few minutes. I never would have allowed it if I had known." But she had known. She had been in that living room, feet away from the door, for 47 minutes. She had made a choice to do nothing, just as she had made choices to do nothing for 36 years. Charlotte said nothing at all. She stared at the video screen with an expression I could not read. Was it shock at seeing the cruelty documented so clearly? Recognition of something she had witnessed many times before? Or fear, perhaps, of what this evidence might mean for her own inheritance? Under the cruelty clause, Ashford continued, his voice cutting through the chaos with professional clarity. Lauren now has the legal right to reduce or eliminate the inheritance of Richard Kennedy, Helen Kennedy, and Charlotte Kennedy. The video evidence is unambiguous, time-stamped, and will hold up under any court challenge. He turned to face me directly. The decision is yours, Miss Kennedy. You can exercise this right immediately, or you can choose to delay. I felt power thrumming through my veins, unfamiliar and intoxicating. For 36 years, I had been powerless in this family. I had been punished and dismissed and made to feel worthless while others decided my fate. Now, for the first time, I held the ability to make them feel what I had felt. I could take everything from them with a single word. But Ashford was not finished. There is one more element to the cruelty clause that you should understand before making any decisions, he said. Margaret included a secondary provision, one designed to test your character as much as to punish theirs. The room fell silent again, everyone waiting to hear what new complication my grandmother had devised. If you exercise this power in a spirit of pure revenge within the first 30 days, Ashford explained, making decisions while emotions run hot, a significant portion of your inheritance will automatically transfer to a charitable trust Margaret established. But if you wait, if you reflect, if you make decisions based on justice rather than vengeance, the full inheritance remains yours, without restriction. I understood then what my grandmother had done. She had given me power, but she had also given me a test. She had known that the temptation of immediate revenge would be overwhelming, that after a lifetime of abuse, I would want nothing more than to destroy the people who had hurt me. But she had also known that giving in to that temptation would make me more like my father, more like the family that had shaped me through cruelty. She wanted to protect me from becoming them. I looked at my father, still red-faced and sputtering about lawsuits that would never materialize. I looked at my mother, still crying tears that had long ago lost the power to move me. I looked at my sister, still silent and watchful, calculating her next move in a game she was only beginning to realize she might lose. I will not make any decisions tonight, I said finally, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Steady, calm, controlled. But starting tomorrow, I am going to learn exactly what this family has done. Every secret you have buried, every lie you have told, everything you have hidden from me and from the world. I turned toward the door, toward Theodore and Attorney Ashford, toward the beginning of a new life I could barely imagine. And then, I said without looking back, I will decide what justice looks like. 2 days after Christmas, I made my first move. I did not revoke anyone's inheritance. That would have been too hasty, too obviously driven by the raw emotions still churning in my chest. My grandmother had designed her test carefully, and I understood that acting within those first 30 days, while anger burned hot, would cost me both morally and financially. Instead, I chose something more subtle, something that would demonstrate my newfound authority without appearing purely vindictive. I called Attorney Ashford and exercised control over the trust fund that had been quietly supplementing my family's lifestyle for years. I had not known about this arrangement until Ashford explained it during our meeting the day after Christmas. My grandmother had established a trust decades ago that provided monthly disbursements to various family members, payments that had been flowing so consistently and for so long that my family had apparently come to view them as entitlements rather than gifts. Charlotte's luxury apartment in the fashionable part of town was subsidized by these payments. My father's risky investment schemes were funded by a credit line backed by trust assets. My mother's spa memberships and shopping trips were covered by a household account that drew from the same source. None of them had earned this money. None of them had even acknowledged where it came from. They had simply taken it month after month, year after year, while treating the woman who provided it with contempt and eventually killing her for the rest. I did not cut them off entirely. I was not trying to destroy them, not yet, not until I understood the full scope of what they had done. But I reduced the disbursements to basic living expenses only. Charlotte's boutique accounts were frozen. The credit line my father depended on for his schemes was suspended pending review. My mother's discretionary spending allowance vanished overnight. I did this because I wanted them to experience even briefly the financial vulnerability I had lived with my entire adult life. I wanted them to know what it felt like to check their bank balance with dread, to wonder if they could afford groceries, to feel the cold sweat of uncertainty that had been my constant companion since I left their house at 18 with nothing but the clothes on my back. They had never worried about money. I wanted them to understand what worry tasted like. The reactions came swiftly, and they revealed everything I needed to know about my family's true priorities. Charlotte called, first screaming so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" she shrieked. "My trip to Aspen is canceled. My credit cards are being declined in front of my friends. Everyone thinks I am poor now, Lauren." Poor. Is that what you wanted, to humiliate me in front of everyone who matters? Not once in her tirade did she mention Christmas Eve. Not once did she acknowledge that I had nearly frozen to death on our parents' porch while she opened presents by the fire. Her only concern was her social standing, her image, the lifestyle she had come to believe she deserved simply for existing. My father's response came via text message, cold and threatening. He wrote about lawyers and lawsuits and making me regret what he called my power play. He invoked legal terms I suspect he did not fully understand, threatened consequences that Attorney Ashford assured me had no basis in law. His fury radiated through every word, but beneath the bluster, I sensed something else: fear. He had spent his entire life controlling others through intimidation and manipulation. Now someone had power over him, and he did not know how to respond, except with the same tactics that had always worked before. My mother left a voicemail that lasted nearly 10 minutes, her voice cycling between tearful apologies and bitter accusations. She claimed I was tearing the family apart, destroying relationships that could never be repaired, acting out of spite rather than love. She invoked my grandmother's memory, insisting that Margaret would never have wanted this kind of conflict among her descendants. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. This woman who had taken money meant to rescue me and used it for her other daughter's private school education now wanted to lecture me about what my grandmother would have wanted. In all of these communications, I noticed the same glaring absence. Not one of them asked how I was doing. Not one of them expressed concern for my well-being after I had spent nearly an hour in potentially lethal cold. Not one of them offered genuine accountability or apology for what they had done. Their only concern was what they were losing. I was still invisible to them, still nothing more than an obstacle to their comfort. That night alone in the modest apartment I had rented years ago, when I finally escaped my family's orbit, I struggled with feelings I did not want to examine. There was satisfaction in watching them scramble, a dark pleasure in their distress that made me uncomfortable when I looked at it directly. I had spent 36 years being powerless. Now I had power, and some part of me enjoyed using it more than I wanted to admit. I called Theodore, who had become my confidant and advisor in the strange new world I now inhabited. I confessed my mixed emotions, my fear that I was becoming something I did not want to be. I wanted them to feel what I felt, I admitted. But now I am not sure if that makes me better than them or just as bad. My grandmother warned me about becoming like my father. What if I already am? Theodore listened with patience. That I was beginning to understand came from his own complicated history with the Kennedy family. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "The difference," he said, "is that you are asking the question at all. Your father has never once in his life wondered whether his actions were justified. He has never questioned whether his cruelty served any purpose beyond his own satisfaction. The fact that you are struggling with this, that you are examining your motives and worrying about becoming like him, proves that you are not him. You never could be." I wanted to believe him. I was not sure I did. Late that night, as I sat in the darkness of my apartment, trying to process everything that had happened, my phone buzzed with a new email. The sender's address was a random string of numbers and letters, obviously created to be untraceable. The subject line was empty. The message contained only a single line of text. "You think this is your story. It is not. Someone who knows what really happened to Margaret." Below the text was an attached photograph. I opened it with trembling fingers and felt my heart stop. The image showed my grandmother in a hospital bed, clearly taken during her final days. She looked small and frail against the white sheets, her eyes closed, her face peaceful in medicated sleep. But she was not alone in the photograph. A figure stood at her bedside, turned away from the camera, captured in the act of reaching toward something near the bed. I could see long blonde hair, a young woman's slim silhouette, a hand extended toward what appeared to be the IV drip, feeding into my grandmother's arm. The timestamp in the corner of the photograph corresponded exactly with the date Theodore had mentioned the date when someone had increased Margaret's sedative medication to dangerous levels. I zoomed in on the figure's hand, and my heart began to pound so hard I could hear it in my ears. On the woman's finger was a distinctive ring, silver band green stone, an unusual antique design I would recognize anywhere. Charlotte had worn that ring every single day since her 18th birthday. It had been a gift from our father, a reward for some accomplishment I could no longer remember. My sister had been in my grandmother's hospital room in the middle of the night 1 week before she died, reaching toward her IV while she slept. The photograph of Charlotte in my grandmother's hospital room haunted me through a sleepless night, and by morning I had made a decision. I was done being reactive, done waiting for revelations to come to me. It was time to take control of this investigation and learn exactly what my family had done. Theodore picked me up at 9 o'clock, and together we drove to First National Bank with the brass key my grandmother had left in her envelope. The key felt heavier than its actual weight as I held it in my palm, warm from my grip, the number 22847 etched into its head like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The bank officer who assisted us was professionally discreet, asking only for identification and the key before leading us to a private room in the vault. The safety deposit box was larger than I had expected, a metal container the size of a small suitcase. A notation in the bank's records showed that the rental had been prepaid through 2035. My grandmother had planned for every contingency, had anticipated that it might take years for her evidence to reach me. When I opened the box, I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. Inside was a collection that spanned decades. Journals bound in leather, their spines cracked from frequent reading and writing. Photographs organized in albums and loose stacks, showing a girl I barely recognized as myself at every age from infancy to adulthood. Report cards I had brought home with pride, only to have them dismissed or criticized. Drawings I had made as a child artwork I thought my parents had thrown away because it was not good enough to keep. Birthday cards I had written to my grandmother that she had preserved like treasures. Margaret saved everything, Theodore said quietly, watching me sort through the artifacts of a love I had never known existed. Every time you achieved something, she found a way to get proof. Every time you were punished unfairly, she documented it. She was building a case, Lauren. She was preparing to fight for you. I picked up one of the journals and began to read, and what I found there made me weep. My grandmother had documented specific incidents with dates, times, and details that brought memories flooding back with painful clarity. One entry from March 2005 read, "Lauren was denied dinner tonight for looking at Charlotte disrespectfully. She is 11 years old, a child. When I called to speak with her, Richard said she was being punished and could not come to the phone. He claims he is building character. He is building a victim. I have contacted my attorney about options." Another entry from September 2012 stopped my breath. "Lauren showed me bruises on her arm during our brief visit today. She claims she fell. Her eyes say otherwise. I have contacted a lawyer about pursuing custody, but Richard has too many connections in this town. The attorney says no judge will take a grandchild from parents who appear respectable on the surface. No one will help me fight my own son. What he has become is my fault, and Lauren is paying the price." The journals painted a picture of a grandmother who had desperately tried to intervene throughout my childhood, blocked at every turn by the legal system's reluctance to interfere in family matters, and by her own complicated guilt over how she had raised my father. She had written letters to teachers called pediatricians, even hired private investigators to document what was happening in our home. All of it had come to nothing. Richard Kennedy was too connected, too charming in public, too skilled at presenting the image of a devoted father while tormenting his daughter behind closed doors. Deep in the box beneath the journals and photographs, I found something that made me pause. An old photograph yellowed with age showing a young man in his 20s standing next to my grandfather. The young man had the same strong jaw as the older figure beside him, the same blue eyes, the same tall frame. It took me a moment to recognize him, but when I did, I looked up at Theodore with a question forming on my lips. "That is a story for another time," he said gently, but I noticed his hand lingered on the photograph, his thumb tracing the edge where my grandfather's image began. There was emotion in his eyes that went far beyond the loyalty of an employee. "Right now, we need to focus on what your grandmother prepared." I set the photograph aside, but I did not forget it. The final section of the box contained what Theodore called the medical evidence. A thick folder held copies of records he had obtained through various means over the past 2 years. Pharmacy records documenting the medication changes that had turned my sharp, brilliant grandmother into a confused shell of herself. Insurance claims filed under her name but signed by my father. A written statement from Margaret's longtime physician, now retired, expressing his suspicion that something was wrong with her rapid decline. And most damning of all, a recorded phone call between my father and someone he referred to only as a consultant. In the recording, Richard Kennedy discussed how to manage his mother's lucidity issues, asking questions about medication interactions and cognitive side effects. The call had taken place 3 months before my grandmother showed any signs of confusion. Her doctor wore a recording device to their final private meeting, Theodore explained. He suspected Richard might try to influence Margaret's care, and he wanted documentation. "This recording proves your father was planning her decline before it even began." I sat in silence, overwhelmed by the scope of what my grandmother had assembled and the depth of my father's premeditation. At the very bottom of the box, I found one final item. A sealed envelope smaller than the others addressed in my grandmother's handwriting to a name that made my heart constrict, my Charlotte. Unlike every other document in this box, this envelope remained unopened. A note was attached, written in Theodore's careful script. Margaret wrote this the day before her confusion began. She asked me to give it to Charlotte when the time was right. I have been waiting for that time ever since. He looked at me with an expression that held both sorrow and resolve. I think it is now. Theodore had arranged a meeting that would answer the questions still burning in my mind about my grandmother's final days. We drove to a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, where a woman in her 50s waited for us in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She introduced herself as Patricia Holloway, a former night nurse at the hospital where my grandmother had spent her final weeks. "I have carried this guilt for 2 years," Patricia said, her voice heavy with the weight of secrets too long kept. "When I saw on the news that there were questions about Mrs. Kennedy's death, I knew I had to come forward. I should have said something sooner. I should have trusted my instincts when things did not feel right." She described what she had observed during her shifts on the ward where my grandmother was treated. Richard Kennedy visited regularly during business hours, always charming to the staff, always bringing flowers or small gifts for the nurses, always asking about his mother's condition and medication schedule with what appeared to be loving concern. The staff adored him. They commented on what a devoted son he was, how lucky Mrs. Kennedy was to have family who cared so much. "But there was another visitor," Patricia continued, her eyes dropping to her untouched tea. "Someone who came late at night after visiting hours ended. She used a family access badge to get onto the ward, the kind we issue to relatives of long-term patients. Young woman, blonde, very pretty. She always seemed nervous when she arrived, almost frightened. Sometimes I would see her crying in the hallway before she went into the room." My stomach clenched as I listened, knowing already who this visitor must have been. "I thought she was just a loving granddaughter having trouble seeing her grandmother so sick," Patricia said. "It never occurred to me that anything sinister was happening. Why would it? She was just a girl barely out of high school. She looked like she was suffering." Theodore spread documents across the table, the evidence he had compiled over 2 years of investigation. Combined with the nurse's observations, a picture began to emerge that made my blood run cold. "Your father's original plan was not murder," Theodore explained, his voice flat with controlled anger. "He wanted Margaret confused enough to be declared mentally incompetent. That would have allowed him to challenge her will in court, to argue that she was not of sound mind when she named you as her primary heir. As her only child, he would have had a strong case for gaining control of her assets. The medication manipulation had been designed to cause temporary cognitive decline, not death. My father had been careful calculating, always adjusting doses just enough to cause confusion, without triggering the kind of medical investigation that might expose his scheme. He had studied the medications, understood their interactions, knew exactly how far he could push before crossing lines that could not be uncrossed. "Your father is a coward," Theodore said bluntly. He wanted the inheritance without the risk of murder charges. He was playing a long game, willing to wait months or even years for Margaret to be declared incompetent rather than take any action that might lead back to him. But something had gone wrong in the final week. Patricia remembered the night clearly, 3 days before my grandmother died. The blonde visitor had arrived later than usual, nearly midnight, and she appeared more agitated than Patricia had ever seen her. She had been crying, her makeup smeared, her hands shaking as she signed in at the nurse's station. She kept checking her phone obsessively as if waiting for instructions or reassurance that never came. Security footage that Theodore had obtained showed her entering my grandmother's room at 11:47 p.m. and leaving at 2:15 a.m. During that window, someone had adjusted Margaret's medication, significantly pushing the sedative doses far beyond anything her doctors had prescribed. "I noticed the change during morning rounds," Patricia said, her voice cracking. "The dosage seemed dangerously high. When I questioned it, I was told that family had authorized the adjustment, that Mrs. Kennedy had been restless during the night and needed stronger sedation. I should have pushed harder. I should have demanded to see documentation. But family authorization was standard procedure, and I had no reason to suspect." She trailed off, unable to finish. Within 48 hours of that night, my grandmother had slipped into the final decline from which she would never recover. The elevated medication levels had pushed her fragile system beyond its ability to compensate. Charlotte, 18 years old, and desperate to please the father who had spent her entire life conditioning her for exactly this kind of obedience, had done what Richard himself was too cautious to do. She had pushed the dosage into lethal territory. I sat in silence, trying to process emotions I could not name. Charlotte had killed our grandmother. That was an undeniable fact that made me sick with horror and rage. My sister's hands had adjusted the IV drip. My sister's choice had ended a life that still had years left to live. But Charlotte had been 18 years old, barely more than a child herself, raised by a manipulative father who had shaped her entire existence around the need for his approval. She had not understood what she was doing, not because she was stupid, but because Richard had deliberately ensured she never developed the moral independence to question his authority. He had created a weapon and then pointed it at his own mother. In a twisted way, Charlotte was as much a victim of our father's manipulation as I was of the family's abuse. We had both been shaped into tools to serve his interests. I was the scapegoat trained to absorb blame and punishment so that he always had someone to direct his cruelty toward. Charlotte was the instrument trained to obey without question so that he always had someone to do his dirty work. I looked at the envelope addressed to Charlotte, still sealed, containing whatever final message my grandmother had wanted her youngest granddaughter to receive. "We need to show her this," I said. "Charlotte needs to know the truth about grandmother, about what she did, about everything. She deserves to understand what our father turned her into." Theodore nodded slowly, but something in his expression told me he was not finished. "There is something else you need to know first," he said, reaching into his briefcase for one more document. "Something that will change how you see your entire family." He laid a paper on the table between us, and I recognized it immediately as a DNA analysis report. "Charlotte is not Richard's biological daughter," Theodore said quietly, "and your grandmother knew it from the very beginning." I arranged to meet Charlotte at a quiet cafe on the other side of town, far from anyone who might recognize us, and far from our parents' ability to interfere. I chose a corner booth with high backs and dim lighting, a place where difficult conversations could happen without an audience. Theodore waited in his car outside, close enough to help if needed, but giving me the space to handle this myself. Charlotte arrived exactly on time, which surprised me. She walked in with her usual defensive posture, arms crossed over her designer blouse, perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light sunglasses pushed up on her head like a crown she had worn so long she forgot it was there. She slid into the booth across from me with an expression of bored irritation, as if this meeting was an inconvenience she was tolerating out of obligation rather than any genuine interest in what I might have to say. "If this is about the money, save your breath," she said before I could speak. "I am not apologizing for being Dad's favorite. Some people just are. It is not my fault you could never figure out how to make him happy." I said nothing. I simply pushed a folder across the table toward her. Charlotte rolled her eyes, but opened it, probably expecting more legal documents about the inheritance she felt entitled to. What she found instead made her freeze. Security footage stills showing a blonde woman entering a hospital room late at night. Medication records documenting dangerous dosage increases. A witness statement from a nurse who remembered the nervous young visitor who came after hours. And photographs time-stamped and undeniable showing Charlotte herself adjusting something near our grandmother's IV drip. I watched my sister's face as she processed what she was looking at. The color drained from her cheeks in stages like water receding from a shore. Her confident mask, the armor she had worn her entire life, began to crack along fault lines I had never noticed before. "I did not know," Charlotte whispered. And for the first time in my memory, I believed my sister was telling something close to the truth. Her voice had lost all its sharp edges, all its practiced superiority. She sounded like a frightened child. "Dad said, he said grandmother was in pain. He said she wanted to go peacefully, but the doctors would not give her enough medication to be comfortable. He said I would be helping her, that it was the merciful thing to do." Her hands shook as she picked up the photographs of herself entering the hospital room, staring at images that proved her presence at a scene she had probably tried to forget. "He told me exactly what to do," Charlotte continued, her voice breaking. "He said she would just sleep more, be more comfortable, that it was what she wanted. I thought I was being kind. I thought I was helping her die with dignity instead of suffering." Tears began streaming down her face, ruining the careful makeup she always wore like war paint. "I was 18 years old. He is my father. I trusted him." I let the silence stretch between us, let Charlotte sit with the weight of what she had done and the dawning horror of how she had been manipulated. Part of me wanted to rage at her, to scream that her trust in our father had killed a woman who loved us both. But another part of me recognized something I had not expected. Charlotte had been as much a victim of Richard Kennedy's manipulation as I had been, just in a different way. "Dad did not favor you because you were special, Charlotte," I said finally, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "He favored you because he had to. Because if he treated you the way he treated me, people might have started asking questions he could not afford to answer." I slid one more document across the table. A DNA analysis report, clinical and precise, with results that would shatter everything Charlotte believed about herself. "Grandmother suspected for years," I explained, as Charlotte stared at the paper without comprehending it. "She finally had it tested when you were 15. She collected hair samples during one of our visits and sent them to a laboratory under a false name. She never told anyone except Theodore. But Dad knew Charlotte. He has always known." Charlotte's eyes scanned the document, the percentages and genetic markers that spelled out an undeniable truth. Richard Kennedy was not her biological father. The man she had spent her entire life trying to please, the man whose approval she had killed for, shared no DNA with her at all. "But he always said I was his perfect daughter." Charlotte stammered, her voice rising with desperation. "His princess, his legacy. Why would he say those things if—" The logic assembled itself in her mind, even as she fought against it. I could see her working through the implications, connecting dots she had never thought to examine before. "He kept you close because he had to," I said quietly. "If he rejected you, if he admitted you were not his pride would be destroyed. His reputation as a family man, a patriarch in complete control, would crumble. Everyone would know that his wife had betrayed him, and Richard Kennedy could not tolerate that kind of public humiliation." Charlotte's breathing had become ragged, her chest heaving with emotions she had probably never allowed herself to feel. "So instead he overcompensated," I continued. "He praised you publicly, showered you with gifts, made you his golden child, all to convince himself and everyone else that this daughter he did not create was worth claiming. And then he used that manufactured bond to turn you into his tool. He made you so desperate for his approval that you would do anything he asked, even adjust a dying woman's medication in the middle of the night." The sound that escaped Charlotte's throat was something between a sob and a scream. Her face contorted with raw animal grief, an expression I had never seen from my composed and controlled sister. The mask was not just cracking now, it was shattering completely. "If he is not my father," Charlotte choked out, her eyes wild with desperation, "then who is? Does Mom know? Has she known this whole time?" I realized I did not have that answer. But I knew someone who might. Our mother, who had accepted grandmother's money in 1998 and broken her promise to save me. Our mother, who had been keeping secrets for over 3 decades. I left Charlotte sobbing in the cafe booth, her world shattered around her like broken glass. Part of me wanted to stay to comfort the sister I had never been close to help her piece together a new understanding of who she was and who had shaped her. But I needed air. I needed space. I needed to process the enormity of what I had just revealed and the emotions churning through my own chest. The winter sun was already setting as I walked to my car, casting long purple shadows across the snow-covered streets. The temperature had dropped since morning, and my breath formed clouds in the frigid air. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, my mind racing through implications I could barely comprehend. Charlotte was not my father's biological daughter. Our mother had kept this secret for over 30 years. Everything I thought I understood about my family's dynamics was built on foundations of lies I was only beginning to uncover. 3 blocks from the cafe, I noticed the black SUV. At first I dismissed it as paranoid imagination. Too many revelations in too few days had left me jumping at shadows, seeing threats where none existed. But when I took an unnecessary turn onto a side street and the SUV followed when I accelerated slightly, and it matched my pace, exactly the fear crystallized into something cold and real. Someone was following me, and they were not trying to be subtle about it. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and headed toward a busier street, somewhere with witnesses, somewhere public enough that whoever was behind me might hesitate to act. The SUV accelerated, closing the gap between us. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the driver's face, and my heart nearly stopped. It was not a stranger. It was not some thug my father had hired to intimidate me. It was Charlotte. Her face was tear-streaked and wild, her hands gripping the wheel with white-knuckle intensity. Her mouth was moving screaming words I could not hear through the closed windows, her expression a mask of desperation and grief that I barely recognized. This was not the composed, superior sister I had known my entire life. This was someone shattered, someone operating on raw emotion rather than rational thought. Before I could process what was happening, Charlotte swerved her SUV toward my car, forcing me toward the shoulder. I yanked my steering wheel hard to the right, narrowly avoiding a collision, my tires skidding on a patch of ice that sent my car into a brief, terrifying spin. Charlotte pulled alongside me close enough that I could see her expression clearly through the window. Not rage, but something worse. Grief. Desperation. The face of someone whose entire reality had collapsed and who no longer knew how to exist in the world. Then the ice caught us both. Charlotte's SUV clipped my bumper as both vehicles hit a frozen patch simultaneously. My car spun the world outside my windows, becoming a blur of white and gray, and I felt the sickening lurch of losing control. I fought the wheel, remembered some distant driving lesson about steering into a skid, and managed to bring my car to a stop against a snowbank. The airbag deployed with a punch that left my ears ringing and my chest aching. Through the settling dust of the airbag, I saw Charlotte's SUV slide across the road in the opposite direction. It hit the far shoulder at a bad angle and tipped into a drainage ditch, landing on its side with a crunch of metal and shattering glass that made my stomach lurch with fear. I stumbled out of my car, my legs unsteady beneath me, and ran toward my sister. All the anger and betrayal and complicated emotions of the past weeks vanished in that moment, replaced by primal concern for another human being in danger. Charlotte was my sister, whatever else she had done, and she was hurt. She was conscious when I reached her hanging sideways in her seatbelt, blood running from a cut on her forehead. She fumbled weakly with the buckle, trying to free herself, making small sounds of pain and confusion. I climbed onto the tilted vehicle and helped her release the belt, easing her out through the window that had shattered on impact. As I pulled her to safety, I noticed what had spilled from the glove compartment onto the passenger seat. A prescription bottle. The label distinctive and familiar, the same medication that had been used to poison our grandmother. Charlotte saw me notice it, and she began to cry with broken, horrible sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her shattered soul. Sirens approached within minutes. Another driver had witnessed the accident and called for help. The police found Charlotte in shock, barely coherent, clutching the prescription bottle like a talisman of sins she could not escape. They found me with whiplash and bruises, but otherwise unharmed, and they found in the back of Charlotte's SUV a packed suitcase and a folder of documents that made the officers exchange significant looks. "I was going to run," Charlotte whispered to me as paramedics loaded her onto a stretcher. "I took those from Dad's study. I was going to take them and disappear and never come back. But then I saw you driving and I thought—" She trailed off, the sedatives the paramedics had administered beginning to take effect. "I thought if I could just make you understand." Her eyes closed and she was gone into medicated sleep. The police bagged the prescription bottle as evidence. They bagged the folder of documents, too. Before an officer sealed the bag, I glimpsed the contents: financial records covered in my father's handwriting, account numbers for institutions I did not recognize, names that meant nothing to me, but clearly meant something to the officers examining them. 3 hours later, I sat in the hospital waiting room, my neck in a brace, my body aching from the impact, my mind still trying to process everything that had happened. Theodore sat beside me, having rushed to the hospital as soon as I called him. Charlotte was in a room down the hall under observation for her injuries and her mental state. A detective approached us, his expression grave in a way that told me more revelations were coming. "Ms. Kennedy," he said, "we have reviewed the documents your sister was carrying. There is evidence here of financial crimes spanning 2 decades, fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, all connected to your father." He paused, and I braced myself for whatever came next. "But there is something else. Some of these transactions involve offshore accounts in your grandmother's name, accounts where money was moved without her authorization in the months before she died." He met my eyes with the steady gaze of someone who had seen too much darkness to be surprised by any of it. "We are opening a formal investigation into Margaret Kennedy's death, and we need your full cooperation." The days following the accident blurred together in a haze of police interviews, hospital visits, and sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling of my apartment. Charlotte remained in the psychiatric ward under observation, sedated, and monitored, her mental state too fragile for formal questioning. My father had hired lawyers the moment he learned about the investigation, surrounding himself with legal protection while refusing to speak to anyone, including his own wife. My mother had retreated into the family home like a wounded animal, not answering calls or opening doors. Attorney Ashford and Theodore arrived at my apartment on the 4th day, their faces grave with the weight of decisions that needed to be made. We sat around my small kitchen table, documents spread before us like a map of possible futures, each path leading somewhere different and irreversible. "The police investigation is proceeding," Ashford explained, his voice carrying the measured calm of someone who had guided clients through difficult moments for decades. "Charlotte is being held for psychiatric evaluation, but once she is deemed stable, she will face questions about her role in Margaret's death. Your father is under investigation for the financial crimes documented in those files, but prosecutors want to build an airtight case before making any arrests. As for your mother—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She has not been named in any investigation yet, but if evidence emerges that she knew about the fraud or the medication manipulation, she could face charges as an accessory." I absorbed this information, feeling the weight of power I had never asked for settling onto my shoulders. "You have significant influence here," Ashford continued. As the victim of the cruelty clause violation, and as Margaret's primary heir with legal standing to pursue civil action, your cooperation or resistance could substantially impact how aggressively this case is prosecuted. He met my eyes directly. You could push for maximum charges against all of them, or you could work with prosecutors on a more targeted approach. The choice hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. Part of me wanted to see them all destroyed. This part had been waiting 36 years, nursing wounds that never healed, dreaming of a day when the people who had tormented me would finally face consequences. I wanted my father in prison, stripped of the power and reputation he valued more than his own children. I wanted my mother exposed for the coward she was forced to confront publicly, the choices she had made, and the daughter she had sacrificed. I wanted Charlotte to understand that actions have consequences, even actions taken in desperate obedience to a manipulative parent. But another part of me remembered my grandmother's warnings, remembered Charlotte's shattered face in the cafe when she learned the truth about her paternity, remembered my mother's pitiful explanation about being trapped by threats she did not have the strength to resist. The people who had hurt me were also in their own ways broken. They had been shaped by forces larger than themselves, caught in cycles of cruelty and manipulation that stretched back generations. Did destroying them completely serve justice, or did it just serve my pain? I pulled out my grandmother's letter, the one I had read so many times. The paper was beginning to soften at the creases. One passage stood out, words I had been turning over in my mind for days. Revenge and justice wear similar masks, but they are not the same. Revenge asks what will hurt them most. Justice asks what will stop the harm and allow healing to begin. I have watched your father destroy himself and others in pursuit of power and control. I do not want that for you, my darling. Whatever you decide, decide it with clear eyes and a clean heart. Decide it for your future, not your past. I understood then what my grandmother had done. The cruelty clause. The 30-day waiting period, the moral test embedded in my inheritance, all of it had been designed for this exact moment. She had known I would face this choice. She had known I would be tempted by vengeance. And she had created a framework that would force me to decide who I wanted to become. 2 days later, I sat across from the lead detective and the prosecutor assigned to my family's case. They watched me with professional neutrality, waiting to hear what direction the victim would want this investigation to take. I want to cooperate fully, I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I want my father held accountable for the financial crimes and for his role in my grandmother's death. He orchestrated everything. He manipulated everyone around him to serve his own interests, including his own children. He deserves whatever consequences the law provides. I paused, thinking of my mother hiding in the house that had never really been hers, thinking of Charlotte sedated in a psychiatric ward with her identity in ruins. But I'm not going to push for charges against my mother unless the evidence is overwhelming. She was weak, not evil. There is a difference. I took a breath. And Charlotte needs help, not prison. She was 18 years old and completely under our father's control. He manipulated her into doing something terrible, something she did not understand. If there is any way to focus her involvement on testimony against him rather than prosecution of her, I support that approach. The prosecutor made notes, her expression thoughtful. That is not the approach we expected, she admitted. Most victims in your position want maximum punishment across the board. I am not most victims, I said, and my grandmother did not raise me to become my father. As I left the prosecutor's office, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer anyway. Lauren, please. My mother's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear or guilt or something I could not identify. I know you have no reason to trust me, but there is something I never told anyone. Not your father, not the police, not even Margaret. I stopped walking, my heart suddenly pounding. Something about the night your grandmother died? My mother continued, her breath shaky on the line. I was there, Lauren, at the hospital. I saw what Charlotte did. A long pause filled with static and the sound of suppressed tears. And I know who told her to do it. It was not just your father. There is someone else involved. Someone you have been trusting." My mother's words echoed in my mind for days after that phone call. Someone else involved. Someone I had been trusting. She had refused to say more over the phone, insisting we needed to meet in person, insisting that what she knew would change everything. I did not know whether to believe her. I did not know if this was another manipulation, another attempt to redirect blame, another lie in a lifetime of lies. But I knew I needed answers, and the only way to get them was to bring everyone together and force the truth into the open. I summoned what remained of my family to my grandmother's house, the house that was now legally mine, for what I framed as a discussion about the future. In truth, it was something far more significant. It was a reckoning. My father arrived first, his lawyer trailing behind him like a shadow. He walked into the house with the aggressive posture of a man who still believed he could control any situation through sheer force of will. He threatened legal action before he even sat down, warning me that I was making a serious mistake, that his attorneys would tear apart any case built on stolen documents and the testimony of mentally unstable witnesses. My mother came alone looking decades older than her 58 years. Her hair was unwashed, her clothes wrinkled her face bare of the careful makeup she usually wore like armor. She clutched a tissue in her trembling hands and avoided meeting anyone's eyes, sliding into a chair in the corner, as if hoping to disappear into the wallpaper. Charlotte arrived last, released from psychiatric hold, but clearly fragile. She moved like someone who had forgotten how her body worked, each step deliberate and uncertain. She sat apart from everyone else, staring at her hands in her lap, not acknowledging our parents or me or anyone else in the room. Theodore stood by my side, steady and silent, as he had been throughout this entire ordeal. Attorney Ashford watched from the corner, ready to intervene if needed, bearing witness to whatever was about to unfold. I looked around the room where I had once stood invisible while my family celebrated Christmas without me. The same fireplace where Charlotte had lounged in cashmere while I froze on the porch. The same chairs where my parents had sat laughing and opening wine while their eldest daughter shivered in potentially lethal cold. Now I stood at the head of this room in front of that fireplace, and I felt the weight of how far I had traveled. I began laying evidence on the dining table. Not all of it, but enough. Photographs from the hospital showing Charlotte entering my grandmother's room after visiting ours. Financial records documenting money moved from grandmother's accounts without her knowledge. The DNA test results that proved Charlotte was not my father's biological daughter. A transcript of my mother's phone call confession, which I had recorded without her knowledge. For 36 years, I said, my voice steady, despite the emotion churning beneath. You told me I was the problem. You told me I was difficult, ungrateful, impossible to love. You told me grandmother did not care about me, that she preferred Charlotte, that I reminded her of everything she regretted. I picked up my grandmother's letter, the cream-colored pages soft from repeated reading. This is what she actually thought of me. This is what she actually left for me. I gestured at the evidence spread across the table. And this is what you actually did. My father attempted his usual bluster, calling the evidence fabricated, demanding his lawyer intervene. But his lawyer had seen the documents. He knew better than to challenge their authenticity. I watched him whisper something to my father, something that drained the color from my father's face. A warning, probably about how much legal exposure these documents represented. My mother began to speak, stopped repeatedly by her own sobs, eventually managing to force out the confirmation I had been waiting for. Yes, she had been at the hospital that night. She had followed Charlotte, suspicious about her daughter's late-night trips. She had watched through the window as Charlotte adjusted the medication drip. She had known something was wrong, had sensed that this was not normal, but she had said nothing because my father had promised everything would be fine, that grandmother would just sleep more peacefully, that it was all for the best. Charlotte listened to our mother's confession with a stillness that was more frightening than hysteria would have been. When our mother finished speaking, Charlotte looked up with eyes that had gone flat and empty. "You watched me kill her," Charlotte said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You watched me do it, and you said nothing." My father's facade cracked completely when he realized his family was not going to present a united front. He turned on each of them in turn, screaming at my mother for being weak and useless, at Charlotte for being too stupid to follow simple instructions, without making a mess at me for destroying the family with what he called my victim act. Everything I did for this family. He shouted, his face purple with rage. Margaret was going to cut us all off. She was going to leave everything to her precious Lauren and let the rest of us rot. I did what any father would do to protect his children. I watched his meltdown with a strange calm. This was who he had always been beneath the charming surface. A man who believed his wants justified any cruelty. A man who had never once taken responsibility for harm he caused. "You did not protect anyone," I said quietly. "You sacrificed everyone else to protect yourself." In the chaos of accusations and tears, Theodore stepped forward. The room fell silent at something in his bearing, something that commanded attention. "There is one more thing this family needs to hear," he said. "Lauren knows most of it, Charlotte knows pieces, but Richard you never suspected." He pulled out the old photograph I had found in the safety deposit box, the one showing a young Theodore standing next to my grandfather. "Margaret was not just my employer, she was my stepmother. Your father was my father too. I am your half-brother Richard." My father's face went white. "That is impossible. Father never—" "Father was human," Theodore said. "Like all of us. He made mistakes and tried to fix them. Margaret took me in when I was 15. She raised me, she loved me, and when you started hurting Lauren, her granddaughter, my niece, she asked me to protect her." His eyes met my father's with 30 years of suppressed contempt. I have been waiting a very long time for this moment. The revelation of Theodore's true identity had shattered whatever remained of my father's composure. He had stormed out of the house with his lawyer trailing behind, shouting threats that no longer carried any weight. My mother had dissolved into tears so complete that Charlotte, despite her own fragile state, had been the one to guide her to the door. The family summit had ended, not with resolution, but with explosion, leaving debris scattered across the landscape of our relationships. 24 hours later, I made my decision official through Attorney Ashford. The Kennedy family home, owned by my grandmother's estate and now legally transferred to me, had to be vacated within 7 days. I did not make this decision lightly. I understood what it meant to be forced from your home, to lose the security of familiar walls and known spaces. But this house had never truly belonged to my parents. They had lived here on my grandmother's generosity, occupying rooms they treated as their birthright, while the woman who actually owned the property was slowly poisoned into confusion and death. I did not leave my family homeless. That would have been cruelty for its own sake, and I had promised my grandmother I would not become my father. Instead, I arranged through Ashford for them to move into a modest apartment in a different part of town. No luxury amenities, no prestige address, no walk-in closets or marble countertops, just basic housing suitable for people who needed to learn what normal life looked like. "This is what normal people have," I told my parents when they came to collect their belongings, their faces tight with humiliation and rage. "This is what I had for years while you lived in a house that was never yours. You will survive. People do." I terminated all financial support from my grandmother's trust to anyone involved in the abuse. My father lost access to the investment accounts he had been using to fund his schemes, accounts that had never been his to use. My mother lost the household allowance that had paid for her spa memberships and shopping trips. Charlotte lost the subsidized apartment, the car allowance, the credit cards that had maintained her carefully curated social lifestyle. These were not punishments, I explained when Ashford questioned whether I was certain. They were simply the end of resources my family had never been entitled to. The trust fund belonged to me. It had always been meant for me, and it would be used according to my values, not theirs. I left one door open, though I was not certain I would ever walk through it myself. If any family member demonstrated genuine change, if they took real accountability for their actions and showed through sustained effort that they understood what they had done, I would consider the possibility of future support. But that future was distant and uncertain. Maybe that required years of proof before it could become anything more. 3 days after the eviction notice was served, my mother appeared at my apartment door. She came alone without the protection of my father or the buffer of my sister. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, diminished by circumstances she had spent decades refusing to confront. In her arms, she carried a cardboard box smaller than a bread box, worn at the corners, clearly retrieved from some long-hidden storage space. "I should have given you this 20 years ago," she said, tears already streaming down her face. "I kept it because I was afraid. Because I thought if you knew everything, you would hate me completely." The box contained letters, dozens of them spanning my entire childhood, written in my mother's careful handwriting on paper that had yellowed with age. Letters she had written to me but never sent. Letters confessing her failures, her fears, her desperate love for a daughter she did not know how to protect. Letters describing plans to leave my father, plans that had formed and fallen apart over and over again across decades of paralysis. I read through them that night alone in my apartment, allowing myself to feel the complicated grief they evoked. My mother had loved me. That much was clear from pages soaked in desperation and guilt. She had seen what my father was doing to me. She had wanted to stop it. She had dreamed of escape, of rescue, of a life where she could be the mother she wished she had the courage to be. But love without action is just sentiment. Love that watches a child be abused and does nothing year after year is not love in any meaningful sense. It is cowardice dressed in tender language, self-pity masquerading as helplessness. The next day, I gave my mother my answer. "I am not ready to have you in my life," I said, watching her face crumple with grief I could not allow myself to soften toward. "Maybe I never will be, but I am not going to slam the door forever. Not yet." I met her eyes, trying to convey the seriousness of what I was offering. "If you want any chance of a relationship with me, start by telling the truth. To the police, to the prosecutors, to yourself. Help them build the case against the man who controlled both of us. Then maybe we can talk about what comes next." She nodded, tears flowing freely, and left without another word. I returned to my grandmother's house that evening to begin the process of making it my own, of transforming it from a site of trauma into something that might eventually feel like home. The winter darkness had already fallen, and the house stood silent and empty, waiting for whatever future I would build within its walls. An envelope lay on the floor just inside the front door, slipped through the mail slot sometime during the day. The handwriting on the front made my stomach clench with recognition. My father's distinctive script, sharp and aggressive, even in simple letters. Inside was a single page, the message brief and venomous. "You think you have won. You think you have exposed everything. But you do not know what I know about Theodore Hayes. Ask him about the year he spent in prison. Ask him what he did to our father. You are trusting a convicted criminal with a grudge against our family. Everything he has told you is a lie designed to destroy us. Sleep well, daughter." My hands trembled as I read the words again. Prison. What he did to our father. I thought of Theodore, who had been my anchor through these terrible weeks, who had revealed himself as my uncle, my protector, the family I had never known I had. I looked up at the empty house around me, feeling uncertainty cloud the trust I had worked so hard to build. What else did I not know? I called Theodore the next morning and asked him to meet me at my grandmother's house. I did not explain why over the phone. I simply told him it was important, and he agreed without hesitation, which either meant he had nothing to hide or that he was very good at hiding things. I was no longer certain which. When he arrived, I handed him my father's letter without preamble. I watched his face as he read it, searching for any flicker of guilt, any tell that might reveal deception. What I saw instead was weariness, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had known this conversation was inevitable and had been dreading it for a very long time. "Your father is not lying about the prison time," Theodore said, and my heart sank even as he continued. "I spent 11 months in a federal facility when I was 24 years old." He moved to the couch and sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 65 years. "But as usual, Richard is only telling you the part of the truth that serves him. Let me tell you the whole story." I sat across from him, bracing myself for another family secret, another betrayal in a lifetime of betrayals. Theodore explained that when he was young and angry, still burning with resentment toward the father who had abandoned him and his mother, he had discovered evidence that the Kennedy family wealth was built partly on financial manipulation. Grandfather Kennedy had engaged in fraud during the early years of his business, cutting corners and falsifying records to build the fortune that would eventually pass to Richard. Furious at this proof that his father was not just cruel but criminal, Theodore had attempted amateur blackmail. He had threatened to expose the fraud unless his father acknowledged him publicly and provided compensation for the years of neglect. It was a stupid plan born of youth and rage, and it had backfired spectacularly. His father had responded not with negotiation but with power. He had Theodore arrested on fabricated embezzlement charges, using his connections in the legal system to ensure conviction. Theodore had served his time 11 months in a federal facility and had emerged to find his world completely changed. His father was dying of cancer eaten from the inside by a disease that had humbled him in ways nothing else ever had. Margaret facilitated a reconciliation of sorts, Theodore said quietly. She had always treated me kindly, even when my father pretended I did not exist. She brought us together before the old man died. He apologized for what that was worth. He acknowledged me in his final weeks when it no longer cost him anything to do so. After his father's death, Margaret had spent the next 4 decades making amends for her husband's cruelty. She had given Theodore a position of trust first as her driver and assistant, eventually as her confidant and ally. When she began to see the same patterns of abuse emerging in Richard's treatment of me, she had shared her concerns with Theodore. Together they had begun planning how to protect me. "Richard knows I went to prison," Theodore said. "He has always used it as proof that I cannot be trusted, that I am a criminal with a grudge against the family, but he does not know the full story. He does not know that his own father framed me. He does not know that Margaret spent 40 years trying to repair the damage her husband caused." I believed him. Despite everything, despite my father's poisonous letter, I believed Theodore. But the revelation had opened a door to something larger, something I needed to understand. I went back to the box of letters my mother had given me, the collection of unsent confessions spanning my entire childhood. I had read most of them already, but now I searched more carefully, looking for anything that might explain the deeper patterns of dysfunction in my family. Near the bottom, I found an envelope addressed not to me, but to my mother. The handwriting was my grandmother's, and the letter inside was dated when I was just a baby. It was an apology, but not for anything my mother had done. It was an apology for Richard. "I know what my son has become," my grandmother had written. "I know it because I helped create him. When Richard was a child, I treated him the way I was treated by my own parents, with impossible standards and conditional love. I demanded perfection from him. I punished failure with coldness and silence. I thought I was making him strong, preparing him for a difficult world. Instead, I made him cruel." The letter continued, each sentence landing like a blow. By the time I understood what I had done, it was too late to undo. He was already the man who hurts others to feel powerful. I have spent the last decade trying to protect Lauren from the monster I helped create, but I fear it will not be enough. I sat with this revelation, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on my shoulders. My grandmother had been harsh to my father. My father had become cruel to me. Charlotte had been shaped into a weapon. Each generation passing down damage like a cursed inheritance, each person wounded and then wounding others in turn. But my grandmother had recognized the pattern. She had spent her final years and her final resources trying to break the cycle to give me a chance to become something different than what my family had made me. The trust fund, the cruelty clause, the moral test embedded in the will, all of it was designed not just to punish the guilty, but to free me from the chain of pain that had bound my family for generations. At the very bottom of the box, I found one final letter. It was addressed to Richard himself, written in my grandmother's handwriting, but it had never been sent. The letter begged my father to get help, to see a therapist, to confront the trauma that had twisted him into the man he had become. It offered to pay for treatment, to support him through recovery, to give him unlimited time and resources to heal. The letter was dated 3 months before my grandmother's confusion began, 3 months before my father started manipulating her medication. She tried to save him. I whispered the pages, trembling in my hands. Even after everything, she tried to give him a chance to change. Theodore nodded, his expression grim, and he responded by killing her before she could follow through. The unsent letter to my father haunted me through another sleepless night, but by morning I had transformed grief into purpose. Among my mother's collection of letters, I had found a cryptic reference to a hidden compartment, something Helen had discovered years ago, but never had the courage to investigate. The clue pointed to a wall safe concealed behind the wedding portrait in my father's study, a room in my grandmother's house that Richard had claimed as his own domain for decades. Theodore and I stood before the heavy-framed photograph of my parents' wedding day, studying the image of two people who had smiled for the camera while building a marriage on secrets and silence. My father looked young and confident in the picture, his arm possessively around my mother's waist. My mother looked beautiful and uncertain, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. We lifted the frame from the wall, and there it was, a small safe built into the paneling painted to match the surrounding wood, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The safe had a combination lock, 6 digits required to open it. Theodore and I looked at each other, the same thought occurring to both of us simultaneously. Charlotte's birthday. The date my father had learned that the child his wife carried was not his biological daughter. The day he had made the choice to claim her anyway, to build his golden child into the perfect weapon while destroying the daughter who actually shared his blood. The combination worked. The safe clicked open. Inside we found decades of carefully preserved secrets. Ledgers recording bribes paid to local officials, politicians and inspectors who had looked the other way while my father built his wealth through fraud. Account numbers for offshore funds created using forged signatures, money hidden from tax authorities and business partners and family members alike, emails printed and filed between my father and the corrupt doctor who had facilitated my grandmother's medication changes, clinical discussions of dosages and effects written in language designed to sound medical rather than murderous. And most damning of all, a handwritten plan in my father's distinctive script outlining step by step how to make Margaret Kennedy legally incapable of managing her affairs within 6 months. The document read like a business proposal, complete with timelines and contingencies, treating my grandmother's mental destruction as nothing more than a project to be managed efficiently. I photographed everything before calling the detective assigned to the case. Within hours, investigators arrived with warrants and evidence bags, transforming my grandmother's house into a crime scene. The detective reviewed the documents with growing disbelief, shaking his head at the scope of what my father had done and the arrogance of keeping such detailed records. "This is enough," he confirmed. "Combined with the witness testimony and financial records we already have, we can arrest Richard Kennedy on multiple charges: elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder." He met my eyes with professional sympathy. "The arrest warrant will be issued within the hour." My father was taken into custody that evening, dragged from the modest apartment I had assigned him in handcuffs, while neighbors watched and whispered. I saw it happen on the evening news, sitting in my grandmother's living room with Theodore beside me. My father's face filled the screen, his expression cycling through disbelief and rage and something that might have been fear. His lawyer stood nearby, promising to fight the charges, insisting his client was innocent of all accusations. 36 years of immunity ended in a single night. When the news segment finished, Theodore turned off the television, and we sat in silence for a long moment. The house felt different now, emptied of the ghosts that had haunted it for so long. My grandmother's presence seemed to fill the space, not as a specter of grief, but as something warmer, something that felt almost like peace. "There is something more I want to tell you," Theodore said finally. "The complete truth about my relationship with your family, with Margaret, with you." He showed me photographs I had never seen, documents that traced his history with the Kennedys across decades. Letters from my grandfather acknowledging Theodore as his son, written in the old man's final weeks when death had stripped away his pride and left only regret. Pictures of Theodore as a young man standing awkwardly at the edge of family gatherings, present, but not quite belonging. I stayed close to this family not for money or revenge. Theodore explained, his voice thick with emotion I had rarely heard from him. "I stayed because Margaret asked me to. Because we both loved you and wanted to protect you." He paused, gathering himself before continuing. "When you were born, Margaret called me immediately. She said, 'Theodore, we finally have someone worth fighting for.' I watched you grow up from a distance. I watched them hurt you, and every instinct I had told me to grab you and run to take you somewhere safe and never look back." His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "But Margaret said we needed to do it right. Legally, completely, so they could never hurt you again. So the cycle would finally break." I looked at this man, who had been my guardian angel for 36 years, who had sacrificed his own desires for revenge in order to execute a patient plan to protect me. He was my uncle by blood, but he was something more important than that. He was the only adult in my entire life who had consistently, unconditionally prioritized my well-being over his own interests. "I always wondered what it would feel like," I said, tears streaming freely down my face, "to have someone in my corner, to have someone choose me." Theodore took my hand, his grip warm and steady. "Margaret and I chose you before you were born," he said. "We have been in your corner every single day. You just could not see us. But we were always there, Lauren. You were never as alone as they made you feel." My phone rang, shattering the moment. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer. "Lauren." Charlotte's voice was thin and fragile, nothing like the confident sister I had known. "I need to see you. The doctors say I'm stable enough for visitors now. I know you have no reason to come, but there is something I need to tell you, something about that night at the hospital that I remembered in therapy, something I could not face until now." Her voice broke, and I heard the sound of crying on the other end of the line. Grandmother was not unconscious when I adjusted the medication. She woke up. She saw me. A shaky breath. And she said something. "I have been trying to forget it for 2 years, but you deserve to know what it was." I never made it to visit Charlotte at the psychiatric facility. Before I could arrange the trip, the story broke. The arrest of Richard Kennedy for conspiracy in his mother's death became local news within hours of his being taken into custody. By the next morning, it had spread to regional outlets, and by the end of the week, national journalists were descending on our small town, drawn by the dramatic elements of the story, like sharks to blood in the water, wealthy family, poisoned grandmother, secret will, Christmas Eve cruelty. It had everything the media loved: money betrayal and the dark underside of American family life. I found reporters camped outside my grandmother's house, their vans lined up along the street, their cameras ready to capture any movement behind the windows. My phone rang constantly, with calls from numbers I did not recognize: journalists seeking comment, producers wanting to book me for interviews, podcasters hoping to tell my story to their audiences. My social media accounts, which I had barely used for years, flooded with messages from strangers demanding details, offering sympathy, accusing me of crimes I had not committed. I had never sought attention. The sudden scrutiny felt like being stripped naked in a crowded room, every private wound exposed to public examination. Theodore helped screen the interview requests, but we both knew that silence would only fuel speculation. Already rumors were spreading online, theories about what had really happened, claims that I had orchestrated everything for the inheritance. If I did not tell my own story, others would tell it for me, and their version would be shaped by whatever narrative served their purposes. I reached out to Margaret Sullivan, a veteran investigative journalist who had been my grandmother's close friend for decades. Now in her 70s, she had spent her career covering corruption and family dysfunction, with a reputation for thorough ethical reporting that prioritized truth over sensationalism. When I called her, she already knew who I was. She had been following the story with personal interest, grieving for the friend she had lost, and furious at what had been done to her. She agreed to an exclusive interview, promising me control over my own narrative within the bounds of journalistic accuracy. I would tell my story in my own words, and she would present it fairly, without the exploitative framing that other outlets might use. The interview took place in my grandmother's living room, lasting over 4 hours. I told her everything: the childhood abuse, the constant criticism, the impossible standards that shifted whenever I came close to meeting them, The Christmas Eve lockout standing in 8-degree weather while my family celebrated inside, the discovery of my grandmother's will and the evidence of her murder, the revelation about Charlotte's paternity and Theodore's true identity. I spoke without self-pity, but without minimizing the harm that had been done to me, without softening the truth to make it more palatable. When Margaret Sullivan asked what I wanted from this public exposure, what I hoped people would take away from my story, I answered without hesitation. I want other people who grew up in families like mine to know they are not alone, I said, and they are not crazy. When everyone around you insists that your reality is wrong, that the abuse you experience is normal or deserved, you start to doubt your own perceptions. I spent 36 years believing I was the problem. I want anyone watching who recognizes themselves in my story to know that they were never the problem. They were never unlovable. They were just trapped with people who could not love. The article published 2 weeks after my father's arrest, and the response exceeded anything I had anticipated. I received hundreds of messages from strangers who recognized their own families in my story. Daughters who had been scapegoated for their brother's failures. Sons who had been made responsible for their parents' emotional needs. Adults who had spent entire childhoods believing they were fundamentally broken, only to realize in middle age that the brokenness had never been theirs. These messages moved me to tears, each one a confirmation that speaking out had been right, that my private pain could serve a public purpose. But there were also negative responses, and I would be lying if I said they did not sting. People accused me of airing dirty laundry for attention, of betraying the sacred bonds of family loyalty, of being ungrateful for whatever privileges my background had provided. A vocal minority insisted that I must be exaggerating, that no family could really be that bad, that I was probably mentally ill myself and had invented or distorted the abuse for sympathy or money. From his cell, my father released a statement through his lawyer. He claimed I was mentally unstable and had been manipulated by Theodore Hayes, whom he characterized as a bitter outsider with a decades-old grudge against the Kennedy family. He accused the media of rushing to judgment based on one-sided accounts and promised that when all facts emerged at trial, he would be fully exonerated. He expressed heartbreak that his daughter had chosen to destroy the family reputation rather than seek healing privately. It was classic Richard Kennedy, positioning himself as the victim, attacking the credibility of anyone who challenged him, admitting nothing, while implying that dark forces were conspiring against him. But the statement fell flat against the weight of documentary evidence now in prosecutors' hands. Even his own lawyer sounded unconvinced during the press conference. My phone rang again, and I almost did not answer, assuming it was another journalist seeking comment. But the number belonged to the hospital where Charlotte had been receiving treatment. "Miss Kennedy, this is Dr. Reeves from the psychiatric unit." The doctor's voice carried concern that made my stomach clench. "Your sister has asked to be discharged against medical advice. Legally, we cannot hold her if she insists on leaving, but I am very concerned about her mental state." I gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "She has been fixated on something she says she needs to do before she can heal. Something involving your grandmother's house. Some kind of closure, she calls it." The doctor paused. "She checked herself out an hour ago. We do not know where she has gone, but she mentioned a warehouse, something about memories." The warehouse. I knew exactly where Charlotte had gone. My grandmother had owned a climate-controlled storage facility outside of town, a massive building where she kept furniture, art, and documents spanning 3 generations of the Kennedy family. I had visited only once years ago when I was a teenager, and I remembered it as a labyrinth of covered shapes and dusty boxes, a museum of family history that no one ever bothered to curate or examine. Theodore confirmed the location and drove me there as evening fell, both of us silent with dread about what we might find. The building loomed against the darkening sky, an industrial structure that seemed out of place among the bare winter trees surrounding it. Most of the windows were dark, but I could see a faint glow coming from somewhere deep inside a light that should not have been there at this hour. Charlotte was here. I could feel it in my bones, that strange sibling intuition that persists even between sisters who have never truly known each other. Whatever happened next would determine whether Charlotte found her way back from the edge or fell over it completely. Theodore stopped the car near the entrance, and I turned to him before getting out. "Stay here," I said. "If she sees you, she might panic. She might do something she cannot take back." He nodded reluctantly, his face tight with worry. "If you are not out in 30 minutes, I am coming in after you." I entered the warehouse alone. The space inside was even more overwhelming than I remembered. My grandmother's entire life was cataloged here, organized and preserved with the meticulous care she had brought to everything she did. Antique furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts waiting to be awakened. Boxes stacked on metal shelves labeled with decades and contents in grandmother's precise handwriting. Filing cabinets containing financial records and legal documents that probably stretched back to my great-grandparents. The faint glow I had seen from outside came from emergency lights in the back section of the building, flickering irregularly, as if the power supply was unstable. I called Charlotte's name and heard only echo my voice bouncing off concrete walls and metal shelving, returning to me empty and alone. I walked deeper into the maze of memory, my footsteps loud in the silence. I passed my grandmother's sewing machine, the old Singer model she had used to make clothes for me when I was a child, before my father cut off her access to me. I passed a wooden crib that must have been my father's when he was an infant, a relic of a time before he became the monster he would grow into. I passed paintings and photographs and the accumulated weight of generations, each object a fragment of a story I was only now beginning to understand. Signs of Charlotte's presence appeared gradually. A coat thrown over a chair, the expensive wool now dusty and crumpled. A designer purse spilled on the floor, its contents scattered across the concrete. A photograph torn from its frame and crumpled into a ball discarded among the debris. I picked up the photograph and smoothed it out, and my heart clenched at what I saw. Charlotte as a toddler, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, sitting on Richard's lap and beaming at the camera with pure childhood joy. Our father smiled his charming public smile, the mask he wore so effectively for everyone outside our home. To anyone who did not know better, it looked like a picture of perfect paternal love. But I knew better now, and so did Charlotte. She had been tearing through the family archives, I realized, searching for something she desperately needed to find. Proof of love, proof of belonging, proof that her entire life had not been constructed on a foundation of lies. Each torn photograph, each overturned box, each scattered document represented another hope, destroyed, another illusion, shattered against the reality of what our father had done. Charlotte was not just looking for closure. She was conducting an excavation of her own betrayal. I rounded a corner into the main storage area and stopped cold. The smell hit me first. Gasoline sharp and chemical cutting through the dusty air with an urgency that made my stomach drop. Charlotte sat in the center of the cleared space surrounded by piles of paper photographs, documents everything she had pulled from the shelves in her frantic search. A red gas can rested beside her, its cap removed the source of the spreading puddle that darkened the concrete floor in an expanding circle. In Charlotte's hand was an envelope I recognized immediately, my grandmother's letter to her. The sealed message that had waited years to be delivered, finally opened. Charlotte's face was tear-streaked, her eyes red and swollen from hours of crying. Her body rocked slightly back and forth in a self-soothing motion that spoke of complete psychological collapse. She looked up as I approached, and something flickered in her gaze that might have been relief at seeing me, or might have been warning to stay away. "She forgave me," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper. She held up the letter, the paper trembling in her shaking hand. "She knew what Dad was making me do. She knew I was coming to the hospital that night, and she forgave me before I even did it." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She said she loved me. She said I was not to blame for what I had been shaped into. She said... Charlotte's voice broke, completely dissolving into sobs that shook her entire body. In her other hand, I saw a lighter. A cheap plastic lighter, bright yellow, the kind you buy at any convenience store. Such a small thing to hold so much destructive potential. "How do I live with that?" Charlotte asked, looking up at me with desperation that went beyond anything I had ever seen in her face. "How do I live knowing she forgave me and I killed her anyway? Tell me, Lauren, tell me how I am supposed to survive knowing that the one person who truly loved me died by my hand while she was in the middle of forgiving me for it. I kept my voice calm, my movements slow, hyper-aware of the gasoline that had soaked into the papers surrounding my sister. One spark from that lighter, and we would both be consumed by flames along with every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence cataloging our family's generations of dysfunction. I needed to keep Charlotte talking. Talking might be the only thing keeping her from striking that lighter. What else did grandmother's letter say? I asked not because I did not want to know, but because I needed Charlotte to focus on words rather than actions, on memory rather than destruction. Charlotte looked down at the pages in her trembling hand, and when she spoke, her voice cracked over every phrase. "My dear Charlotte," she read aloud, "I have watched you become lost in your father's shadow. I have watched him use your need for approval as a weapon, shaping you into an instrument of his will without ever letting you see what he was doing. I do not blame you for what you are about to do. I blame myself for not stopping him sooner, for not finding a way to reach you before he turned you against yourself and everyone who might have loved you." Charlotte's voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "Whatever happens in the coming days, know that I love you. Know that the fault belongs to those who shaped you, not to the shape you became." She looked up at me with devastation so complete that it seemed to hollow out her features. "She knew she was going to die," Charlotte whispered. "She knew I was coming that night, knew what Dad had sent me to do. She could have stopped me. She could have called security, pressed the emergency button, warned someone, anything, but she just let me do it. She let me kill her." I inched closer, close enough now to see the tears cutting tracks through the dust and soot on Charlotte's face, close enough to smell the gasoline mixing with the expensive perfume she still wore even in the depths of her breakdown. My grandmother had made a choice that night in the hospital. She had chosen to let Charlotte complete the terrible task Richard had assigned her, knowing it would lead to her own death. She had done it not out of resignation, but out of love, a final gift to the granddaughter she knew was as much a victim as Lauren had ever been. "Because she understood," I said carefully. "She understood that you were as trapped as I was, just in a different cage." I lowered myself to the concrete floor across from Charlotte, putting myself within range of any fire she might start, demonstrating a trust that felt insane but also necessary. If my sister was going to survive this moment, she needed to know that someone was willing to sit with her in the darkness. "You think you were the favorite Charlotte, the golden child. But what is gold except a pretty prison?" I held her gaze, willing her to hear what I was saying. "Every compliment Dad gave you was a chain. Every gift was a reminder that your value depended on performance. You were never allowed to fail. Never allowed to be average, never allowed to be anything except what he needed you to be. You were not loved, Charlotte. You were used." Charlotte listened, the lighter still clutched in her hand, but momentarily forgotten. "I was invisible," I continued. "You were a trophy. Neither of us was loved. We were just tools, shaped for different purposes in his endless pursuit of control." Charlotte's hand trembled the cheap yellow plastic of the lighter, catching the glow of the emergency lights. Then she said something that should have hurt, but instead felt like the first honest thing she had ever spoken to me. "I wanted you to disappear," she admitted, the words ugly and raw. "When we were kids, I used to pray that you would just go away, because when you were around, Dad compared us, and I had to keep winning. I had to keep being better than you, being perfect, being everything he demanded, because if I was not—" She could not finish the sentence, but I could finish it for her. "Because if you were not better than me, then what was the point of everything you sacrificed? What was the point of losing yourself to become his perfect daughter?" Charlotte's face crumpled completely. The lighter slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the concrete floor. She reached for it reflexively, and I reached at the same moment, but not to stop her. I reached to hold her hand. For the first time in our entire lives, my sister and I touched each other in something other than competition or conflict. Her fingers were cold and trembling, slick with gasoline residue, but I held them anyway. I held them like they were precious, because in that moment they were. I could light this place, Charlotte whispered, her eyes fixed on the lighter lying between us. End it all. Every photograph of him smiling at me like I was his treasure, every lie documented in these boxes, everything that proves what we are, what he made us become. I gripped her hand tighter. You could, but then he wins. Then our father's cruelty succeeds in destroying both of his daughters. Me through years of abuse, you through one terrible night. I gestured at the warehouse around us, the accumulated weight of generations of Kennedy dysfunction. Or we survive. Both of us. We get out of here, and we get help, and we spend the rest of our lives being something other than what he made us. Charlotte looked at the letter still clutched in her other hand, grandmother's forgiveness offered from beyond the grave. Do you think I can ever be forgiven? She asked, and her voice was that of a child seeking absolution. Really forgiven, not just words on paper. I did not lie to her. She deserved better than lies. I do not know, I said. Maybe not, but I know you can be different. And maybe that matters more than forgiveness. Charlotte released a shuddering breath that seemed to empty her completely. Then she nodded just once and surrendered the lighter into my palm. I closed my fingers around it and slipped it into my pocket, removing the possibility of impulsive destruction. We stood together, and Charlotte leaned on me as we made our way through the maze of boxes and covered furniture toward the warehouse entrance. Her body felt fragile against mine, lighter than I remembered, as if grief had hollowed her out from the inside. Then sirens split the air. Police cars, fire trucks, their lights painting the warehouse windows in alternating red and blue. Someone must have seen us enter or smelled the gasoline, or Theodore had called for help when I did not emerge in time. The door burst open and uniformed officers flooded in, shouting commands I could barely process through the ringing in my ears. They forced both of us to the ground standard procedure when entering a scene with potential accelerants. I felt the cold concrete against my cheek, felt Charlotte's hand still gripping mine, even as officers secured our wrists. Through the chaos, I heard one of them speaking urgently into his radio. We need EMTs here now, and notify Detective Morrison. We have a situation at the Kennedy property. A pause filled with static. Richard Kennedy's lawyer is claiming his client attempted suicide in custody an hour ago. They are saying he left a confession. The police separated Charlotte and me, immediately moving us to opposite sides of the warehouse, while officers secured the scene. I was questioned by a young detective who looked barely old enough to vote his notebook, open his pen, scratching across the page as I explained what had happened. My sister was in crisis. I came to help. No fire was started. No crime was committed. The words felt mechanical, leaving my mouth factual statements that did nothing to capture the emotional devastation of what I had just experienced. The fire department arrived and confirmed the scene was safe. Hazmat crews cleaned up the gasoline, documenting everything with photographs and careful notation. I watched them work through a fog of exhaustion, my body still trembling from adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. Through all of it, I kept looking for Charlotte, craning my neck past uniformed shoulders, needing to know that my sister was being handled gently rather than roughly. I finally spotted her near the warehouse entrance, being loaded into an ambulance by medical personnel rather than escorted by police. A psychiatric hold probably given the gasoline and the lighter and her obvious mental state, but also safety. She was being taken somewhere she could be watched and protected and helped. Charlotte was alive. That was what mattered. That was what I had fought for in that terrifying conversation on the concrete floor. Detective Morrison appeared at my side, his face grave in a way that prepared me for bad news before he spoke a word. He was older than the detective who had questioned me, his hair gray at the temples, his eyes carrying the weight of too many difficult conversations delivered to too many shattered families. There is no easy way to say this, he began, and I braced myself for whatever was coming. Your father was found unresponsive in his cell approximately 3 hours ago. He had managed to hide medication, we are still investigating how, and took an overdose. Medical staff attempted resuscitation, but they were unsuccessful. The words washed over me, their meaning slow to penetrate the fog in my mind. My father was dead. Richard Kennedy, the man who had tormented me for 36 years, who had poisoned his own mother for her money, who had twisted my sister into a weapon and destroyed my childhood with calculated cruelty, was gone. He had chosen to end his life rather than face the consequences of what he had done. I waited to feel something. Relief, perhaps, that my tormentor could never hurt me again. Grief, maybe, for the father I had always wanted but never had. Triumph that he had been brought so low. Loss for a relationship that might have been different if he had been capable of love. Instead, I felt hollow, empty, like something that was supposed to be momentous had turned out to be simply nothing. He had died the way he lived, making choices that served only himself, leaving destruction in his wake, refusing to face what he had done. Morrison handed me a photocopy of a handwritten note. This was found in his cell. The original is evidence, but the prosecutor agreed you should see it. I read my father's final words, and I felt a grim recognition settle into my bones. There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, no acknowledgement of the harm he had caused to so many people across so many years. Instead, the note was a final act of blame, a last manipulation from beyond the grave. He blamed me for destroying the family with what he called my obsession with the past. He blamed my mother for failing to control her emotions. He blamed Charlotte for being weak. He blamed Theodore for poisoning Margaret against her own son. And he blamed Margaret herself for never truly loving him, despite claiming to for favoring Lauren, for leaving her money to the wrong grandchild. The note ended with words that could have been a manifesto for his entire twisted existence. I am not guilty of anything except trying to hold this family together. History will vindicate me. Even in death, Richard Kennedy refused to accept responsibility for anything he had done. Even his final act was a manipulation designed to plant seeds of guilt in anyone who read his words to make us wonder if we had pushed him too far, if his death was somehow our fault. For a long moment, I stared at the photocopy, feeling my father's words try to burrow into my mind the way they had for 36 years. He wanted this letter to haunt me. He wanted me to carry his death as another burden of undeserved guilt. He wanted to win, even in losing, to maintain his grip on my psyche, even after his heart stopped beating. But something inside me had changed through these terrible weeks. I recognized the manipulation for what it was. I saw through the victim language to the narcissism beneath. My father had never loved anyone, including himself. He had died as he lived alone, blaming everyone else incapable of growth or change or genuine human connection. He could have chosen differently, I said, finally folding the photocopy and handing it back to the detective. Right up until the end, he could have chosen to take responsibility, to face consequences, to try to make amends, maybe even to find some kind of redemption. I took a deep breath of the cold night air. He chose this instead. That was his choice, not mine. Morrison nodded, something like respect flickering in his tired eyes. He tucked the note away and excused himself to continue managing the scene. Theodore arrived moments later, breathless from rushing across town when he heard the news. He pulled me into a fierce embrace without asking permission, without hesitating, holding me with the desperate relief of someone who had feared the worst and found it not quite as bad as imagined. "I just heard," he said into my hair. "Are you all right? Tell me you are all right." I let myself be held. I let myself feel the support of someone who had never once blamed me, manipulated me, or made me doubt my own sanity. Theodore had spent 30 years waiting for this moment, protecting me from a distance, sacrificing his own desire for revenge against Richard in order to execute the patient plan my grandmother had designed. "I do not know what I am," I admitted, my voice muffled against his coat, "but I am still here, and that is more than he wanted." Over Theodore's shoulder, I saw paramedics loading Charlotte into a second ambulance. She was conscious, wrapped in a silver emergency blanket, her face pale but alert. As if sensing my gaze, she turned and met my eyes through the rear window of the ambulance. Charlotte raised one hand in a gesture that might have been a wave or might have been a plea, an acknowledgement, a question, a reaching towards something neither of us knew how to name yet. I raised my hand back. Whatever happened next, we would face it as something new, not sisters bound by lies and competition and a father's toxic manipulation, but two survivors who might eventually learn to build something true. 2 weeks after my father's death, Attorney Ashford requested a meeting to discuss what he called final provisions of my grandmother's estate. I had thought we were finished with legal matters, that the will had been fully executed, and all that remained was the slow work of healing. But Ashford's tone on the phone suggested there was something more, something that had been waiting for the right moment to be revealed. He explained that there was one element of the will that could only be disclosed after certain conditions were met, specifically after any criminal proceedings related to my grandmother's death were resolved. My father's suicide had effectively closed the case. There would be no trial, no verdict, no public accounting of his crimes. The prosecutor had announced that charges would be dropped given the defendant's death, though the investigation's findings would remain part of the public record. Ashford handed me a sealed envelope notarized and dated the day before my grandmother's confusion began. The day before my father started destroying her mind. "Margaret made me promise to deliver this personally at the appropriate time," he said. "She was very specific that you should read it alone first, then decide whether to share it with anyone else." I took the envelope to my grandmother's garden, now my garden, and opened it in the pale spring sunshine. The winter had finally broken, and the first crocuses were pushing through the thawed earth purple and white promises of renewal. The letter was longer than any of the others, filled with my grandmother's distinctive voice. Warm but unsentimental, loving but clear-eyed. She wrote about watching me grow up, about recognizing early that I had inherited not just her blue eyes but her moral compass. She wrote about the pain of watching Richard abuse his daughter while being unable to intervene effectively, blocked by legal systems, and her own guilt over how she had raised him. And she wrote about her final plan. "I had to know," Margaret explained, "that giving you this inheritance would not corrupt you the way wealth and power corrupted your father. I designed a test you would not know you were taking. Every choice you made to wait before exercising the cruelty clause, to pursue justice rather than revenge, to show mercy to Charlotte, to refuse to become what they tried to make you, was observed and recorded by William Ashford and Theodore." I read the specific criteria she had established. If I had immediately revoked all family inheritance in obvious vengeance, a portion of the estate would have transferred to charity. If I had publicly humiliated family members beyond what justice required, another portion would redirect. If I had refused to show any mercy to Charlotte despite evidence of her manipulation, another portion still. Each test represented a way I could have let bitterness consume me, and each test I had passed without knowing I was being evaluated. "You chose justice over revenge," my grandmother wrote. "You chose measured consequences over maximum cruelty. You chose to see your sister as victim as well as perpetrator. You chose in the end to break the cycle rather than continue it. I am prouder of you than words can express." Ashford confirmed what the letter implied. Because I had passed every test, the full estate transferred to me without restriction or condition. He presented the final accounting investment properties worth several $1 million, stock portfolios, trust funds, my grandmother's personal collection of art and jewelry. I was now wealthy by any reasonable standard. But the true inheritance was not the money. It was my grandmother's confidence. It was the knowledge that I had been tested and found worthy. It was proof that despite everything my family had tried to make me, I remained capable of mercy, justice, and grace. Ashford produced one final document. "I almost did not include this," he admitted. "It is personal, but Margaret insisted you would want to see it when the time came." The letter was addressed not to me, but to Theodore. "My dearest son," it began, "because that is what you have been to me, regardless of blood. I have one last request. When this is over, when Lauren has proven herself as I know she will, tell her everything, not just about your past, but about your future. Tell her about the foundation I want you to build together. Tell her about the cycle we have spent our lives trying to break. And tell her that family is not just who you are born to, it is who you choose." I looked up at Theodore, the uncle I had only recently learned existed, and saw tears streaming down his weathered face. 1 year later, I stood in a building that used to be my prison and had become something else entirely. The Kennedy family home no longer existed, not as it was. I had spent the spring and summer overseeing its complete renovation, gutting the interior where so much pain had occurred, tearing out walls that had witnessed decades of cruelty, redesigning every space according to a new vision. Where the living room once stood, where I had watched my family celebrate through frost-covered windows while I froze on the porch, now sat the reception area for the Margaret Kennedy Center for Family Healing. The fireplace where Charlotte had lounged in cashmere while I shivered outside now warmed a group therapy room where survivors shared their stories and learned they were not alone. The transformation had cost much of my inheritance. I had never spent money more gladly. Charlotte stood near the entrance in a simple blue dress, so different from the designer labels she used to wear like armor. The past year had been brutal for her intensive therapy, confronting her role in our grandmother's death, learning to separate her identity from our father's approval. She had pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and received a suspended sentence with mandatory continued treatment, the court recognizing that she was both perpetrator and victim. We were not close, might never be close in the conventional sense, but we had forged something more valuable: mutual respect between two survivors who understood each other's damage and had chosen to heal rather than perpetuate harm. My mother sat in the back row looking uncomfortable but present. We had not reconciled, might never fully reconcile. But she had testified against my father's estate, had begun her own therapeutic journey, had started the slow work of understanding how she became complicit in her daughter's destruction. She did not ask for forgiveness. She asked only for the chance to show through years of action that she was capable of change. Theodore stood beside me as I prepared to speak my uncle, my protector, the father figure I had always needed. Together, we ran the foundation my grandmother had envisioned, using the remaining estate assets to fund research outreach and support services for survivors of family abuse. I stepped to the podium and looked out at the assembled crowd. 1 year ago tonight, I said, my family locked me outside in the cold on Christmas Eve. They closed the door and celebrated while I nearly froze. At the time, I thought that door closing was the end of my story, the final proof that I would never belong, never be loved, never matter to anyone. I paused, looking at Theodore, at Charlotte, even at my mother in the back row. I was wrong. That door closing was the beginning. My grandmother and my uncle had been holding another door open for me my entire life, a door that led to truth, to healing, to the family I was always meant to have. I gestured at the center around us. Tonight this place opens its doors to anyone who has been locked out by the people who were supposed to love them. You are not alone. You are not crazy. You are not unlovable. And there is always another door. Later that night, after the guests departed, I walked through the empty center with Theodore beside me. We stopped in front of a portrait hanging in the main hallway my grandmother Margaret painted from a photograph taken in her final healthy year, her blue eyes warm and her smile gentle. "Did I make you proud?" I whispered. Theodore put his arm around my shoulders. "She was proud of you before you did any of this. She was proud of you simply for surviving." I nodded, tears slipping down my cheeks, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of completion of a cycle finally broken. I turned off the lights and walked out into the December night, where fresh snow was falling, and the world lay clean and quiet and full of possibility. Behind me, the door clicked softly closed. But it would open again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that. Because that is what doors are for, not to lock people out, to let them in. And that is where Lauren's story ends, but perhaps yours is just beginning. If you grew up in a family that made you feel invisible, if you have ever been locked out in the cold by people who were supposed to love you, if you have spent years believing you were the problem when you were never the problem at all, I hope this story reminded you of one simple truth. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to be loved. And there is always another door waiting to open for you. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story of survival and triumph. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone finally saw the real you? Have you found your own door to healing? Share your thoughts, your stories, your hopes. This community is built on connection, and your voice matters here. Thank you for watching until the very end. Until next time, remember the doors others close can never stop. The doors life opens for you.